Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. It was a warm summer afternoon, and Alice was sitting under a large tree in the garden of her house, struggling to keep her eyes open while her older sister read aloud from a boring storybook. The golden sun filtered lazily through the leaves, creating dancing patterns on Alice's blue dress, and she sighed repeatedly, wishing the book had at least a few illustrations to make it more interesting to read. "What's the use of a book without pictures?" she muttered to herself, absent-mindedly playing with the daisies growing around her. Then something extraordinary happened, something that would change her life forever. A white rabbit, wearing an elegant vest and carrying a pocket watch, ran past her. The most surprising thing was not his peculiar outfit, but the fact that he was anxiously checking his watch, repeating aloud, "Ouch, ouch, I'm going to be late, very late." Alice blinked several times, wondering if the heat of the day was affecting her mind. Rabbits didn't wear vests, let alone carry watches or talk about appointments. But before she could fully process what she was seeing, her natural curiosity took over, and she found herself running after the curious animal. The rabbit disappeared behind a bush, and Alice followed it without hesitation. To her surprise, she discovered a huge rabbit hole under a bush. It was bigger than any burrow she had ever seen, and something about it seemed inviting, almost magical. Without a second thought, Alice bent down to look inside. The ground beneath her knees suddenly gave way, and she found herself falling into a deep, dark hole. The fall seemed endless, but strangely, it wasn't frightening. The walls of the tunnel were full of shelves, maps, pictures, and curious objects. She floated past a bookcase full of jam jars, an ornate mirror, and even a cat sleeping in a velvet armchair. As she fell, Alice began to question her own sanity. Am I dreaming? But I've never had a dream this vivid. What if I'm going mad? But do mad people know they're mad? I don't think so. Her thoughts were interrupted when she landed softly in a pile of dry leaves. Recovering from her fall, Alice found herself in a long, low corridor, lit by a series of lamps that hung from the ceiling. The white rabbit was still in sight, running hurriedly around a corner. Alice followed him, determined to find out where he was going in such a hurry. The corridor led to a circular room with several doors of different sizes. In the center was a glass table with a small golden key on it. Alice tried the key in all the doors, but none would open, except the smallest one, which was so small it could barely fit a mouse. Returning to the table, she found a bottle that hadn't been there before. The label read, "Drink me," in elegant letters. "Well, if it makes me grow smaller, I can get through the little door," Alice reasoned. "And if it makes me grow bigger, I can reach the key that's too high. One way or another, something interesting is going to happen." She drank the contents of the bottle, which had a curious taste, a mixture of cherry pie, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, and hot caramel. Immediately, she began to shrink down to the perfect size to pass through the small door. However, she realized that she had left the golden key on the table, now unreachable due to its diminutive size. Frustrated, Alice noticed a small cake with the words "Eat me" written on it in raisins. "Well, I'll eat it," she decided. "If it makes me bigger, I can reach the key, and if it makes me smaller, I can crawl under the door." The result was more dramatic than she expected. It grew so big that its head hit the living room ceiling. "Curiouser and curiouser," exclaimed Alice, surprised to realize that she was making up words. Her tears of frustration were now the size of a bathtub, and soon the room began to fill with water. In the midst of her dilemma, the white rabbit passed by again, even more hurriedly, dropping his white gloves and fan. Alice picked them up and, shaking herself with the fan, realized that she was shrinking again. Soon she was swimming in a sea of her own tears, along with several other creatures that had been swept away by the current. Among the creatures was a very dignified mouse. who seemed rather irritated by the whole situation. "Mr. Mouse," Alice began politely, "can you tell me how to get out of here?" The rat just looked at her with disdain and started swimming away, followed by a duck, a dodo, and several other strange creatures. Alice followed the group to the shore, where they all gathered, soaking wet and grumpy. The dodo suggested a racing committee to dry off, in which everyone ran around in circles without a defined finishing point. Alice found it all very confusing, but took part nonetheless, realizing that in this strange place, logic seemed to work differently. As she ran with the creatures, Alice began to understand that she had entered a world where the normal rules didn't apply. A world where rabbits wore watches, rats were dignified enough to be offended, and races didn't have to have winners. It was a world that defied everything she knew and yet somehow made its own kind of sense. The sun was beginning to set in this strange place, painting the sky in colors Alice had never seen before. The shadows lengthened in impossible ways, and she could swear that some of them winked at her. The white rabbit had disappeared again, but now Alice was determined to explore this wonderful world, no matter how strange or frightening it might seem. As Alice familiarized herself with this peculiar new world, the white rabbit reappeared in the distance, still frantically checking his watch. Without hesitation, she said goodbye to the drenched creatures and followed the hurrying animal along a winding path that meandered through impossibly colored trees. "Please wait," called Alice. But the rabbit only muttered something about the Duchess being furious and disappeared behind a bend. Turning the corner, Alice came across a charming, albeit somewhat crooked, house with chimneys that spewed smoke in the shape of letters of the alphabet. Approaching the door, she noticed that it was once again the wrong size, this time too big to pass through. Luckily, she found another jar labeled "Drink Me" in the garden. After her previous experience, Alice was more cautious, taking only a small sip. To her relief, it shrank to the ideal size. Inside the house, she found a chaotic scene. A duchess cradling a baby who cried nonstop, while a cook poured almost the entire pot of pepper into a steaming soup. The air was so charged with pepper that everyone was sneezing constantly. "Why so much spice?" asked Alice between sneezes. "Because it is," replied the cook harshly, throwing a pot in the direction of the duchess, who was still nursing her baby with a nonsensical song about bats and tea. In the midst of the confusion, Alice noticed a smile floating in the air. Gradually, a striped cat materialized around the smile. It was the famous Cheshire Cat, about whom she would soon hear much more. Its bright eyes watched her with a mixture of amusement and wisdom. "Where should I go?" Alice asked the cat, hoping for a straight answer in the midst of so much chaos. "That depends a lot on where you want to go," replied the cat, his smile widening impossibly. "It doesn't really matter, as long as I get somewhere," said Alice. "Oh, then you'll certainly get somewhere," assured the cat, "if you walk long enough." While they were talking, the Duchess suddenly threw the baby into Alice's arms and hurried off, muttering something about a game of croquet with the Queen. Alice looked at the baby and, to her surprise, it began to turn into a little pig, which soon escaped into the garden. "Does it happen often around here?" Alice asked the cat. "What? Babies turning into little pigs?" The cat laughed. "More than you might think. By the way, if you want a really interesting afternoon, I suggest you visit the Mad Hatter. He's having a tea party just over there." The cat pointed with his paw to a path that Alice was sure hadn't been their seconds before. Before she could fake him, the feline began to gradually disappear, from tail to head, leaving only his characteristic floating smile. Following the cat's suggestion, Alice walked along the new path, which seemed to change direction when she wasn't looking. The trees whispered incomprehensible conversations among themselves, and flowers of impossible colors turned their petals to watch her pass. Soon, she began to hear the sounds of laughter and the clinking of teacups. As she approached, she saw a long table set up for tea in the garden, laden with teapots, cups, cakes, and other delicacies. The Mad Hatter was presiding over the table, wearing an extraordinarily tall hat, accompanied by a March hare and a caxing whale who seemed to be sleeping in a teacup. "There's no room, there's no room," they shouted when Alice approached. "There are plenty of seats," she replied, taking a seat in a large armchair at the head of the table. "Would you like some wine?" offered the Mad Hatter. "I don't see any wine," said Alice, looking around the table. "There isn't any," replied the March Hare. "Then it wasn't very polite to offer it," said Alice angrily. "It wasn't very polite to sit down uninvited," retorted the Hare. "I didn't know it was your table," said Alice. "It's set for much more than 3 people. "Your hair needs a cut," said the Hatter, abruptly changing the subject and watching Alice with great interest. "You should learn not to make personal comments," Alice replied sternly. "It's very rude." The Hatter's eyes widened. "Why does a crow look like a desk?" Before Alice could answer this impossible riddle, Caxingle woke up briefly to mutter something about melted butter and went back to sleep, dipping his nose into his cup of tea. The Hatter and the Hare started trying to stuff the little animal into a teapot, claiming he needed a bath. Alice watched everything with a mixture of fascination and confusion. Every time she tried to make sense of the situation, something even more absurd happened. The tea was served at random times. The story started in the middle, and the jokes weren't funny, or maybe they were so funny that she couldn't understand them. "What time is it?" asked the Hatter, nervously shaking his watch. "It's 6 o'clock," replied Alice. "2 days late," exclaimed the Hatter. "I told you butter wouldn't be good for the mechanism." "It was the best butter," added the Hare sadly. Alice was beginning to realize that time and logic worked completely differently in this place. The Hatter's clock marked the day of the month, not the hour, and apparently it was always 6 o'clock perpetual tea time. As the tea party continued in its endless cycle, Alice realized that she would get nowhere if she stayed there. Politely, she got up from the table, leaving the Mad Hatter and the March Hare to discuss whether time could be churned like butter. "Time is very sensitive," explained the Hatter as Alice walked away. "Ever since we fought, it has stopped at 6 o'clock for us. Always tea time." Following a new path through the forest, Alice came across a tree with a door in its trunk. Curiously, there were several signs pointing in different directions, all indicating through here and through there, but none of them seemed to make sense. That's when the Cheshire Cat's smile appeared again, followed by the rest of him. "How's your adventure going?" asked the cat, spinning upside down in the air. "It's all very confusing," replied Alice. "The people here are quite rude, and nothing seems to make sense." "Oh, but it makes sense," replied the cat. "Just not the kind of sense you're used to. By the way, the Queen is having a game of croquet. You should go. Everyone should go, or they'll lose their heads." Before Alice could protest, the cat began to disappear again, this time starting with its head and ending with its smile, which she found particularly disturbing. Following the enigmatic feline's directions, Alice soon arrived at a beautiful garden. Gardeners in the shape of playing cards were busy painting white roses red, working frantically and spilling paint everywhere. "Why are you painting these roses?" asked Alice, curious. "Well," replied the Five of Wands, looking nervously over his shoulder, "we planted white roses by mistake, and the Queen of Hearts hates white roses. If she finds out, she'll have our heads cut off." No sooner had he finished speaking than trumpets sounded announcing the arrival of the royal court. The Queen of Hearts was an imposing and frightening figure, with a face red with anger and a crown that seemed too big for her head. The king walked a few steps behind, looking worried and much smaller than his wife. "Who painted my roses?" shouted the queen when she saw the paint dripping from the flowers. "Cut off their heads." The poor gardeners threw themselves to the ground, begging for mercy, but the queen had already lost interest in them, having noticed Alice. "And who are you?" asked the monarch, her small, bright eyes fixed on the girl. "I'm Alice, your majesty," she replied, bowing as her sister had taught her. "Do you know how to play croquet?" asked the queen. "Yes," replied Alice, although she suspected that croquet in this place would be very different from what she knew. She was right. The bats were live flamingos that insisted on turning their necks at the wrong moment. The balls were hedgehogs that often decided to roll off on their own, and the hoops were made up of the card soldiers who wouldn't stand still in their positions. The queen played with frightening violence, brandishing her flamingo like a weapon and shouting, "Cut his head, OFF," at anyone who dared to beat her, which nobody did, of course. The king followed her, silently forgiving everyone she condemned. During the game, Alice noticed that the Cheshire Cat appeared and disappeared among the guests. causing even more confusion. The queen, who apparently didn't like cats, became increasingly furious at his appearances. "If that cat doesn't stop teasing me, cut his head off," shouted the queen. "But he doesn't have a body at the moment, your majesty," remarked Alice. "How can you cut off the head of someone who only has a head?" This logical question left the queen momentarily speechless, her face turning even redder. The king took the opportunity to suggest a tea break, which fortunately distracted his wife from the question of the impossible decapitation. During tea, served at a gigantic table in the garden, Alice found herself sitting between the White Rabbit, who was still nervously checking his watch, and the Duchess, who had been released from prison especially for the event. "The moral of all this," began the Duchess, "is that love makes the world go round." "Someone said it's pride that does that," commented Alice, trying to remember something she had read. "Whatever," said the Duchess. "It can be both, as long as you find a moral in everything." The banquet was a surreal sight. Pies that sang when cut, puddings that changed color, and cookies that made people grow or shrink at random. Alice ate very carefully, fearing that she would change size in the middle of the real dinner. The conversation at the table was just as strange. The queen was arguing with the griffin about the best way to perform a dance, while the false turtle was crying into his soup, remembering his school days at the bottom of the sea. The Mad Hatter had snuck into the party and was now trying to fix the White Rabbit's clock using butter and cake crumbs. "Is all this a dream?" Alice wondered aloud, observing the chaos around her. "If it's a dream, whose is it?" replied the Cheshire Cat, materializing in an empty chair. "Yours." "Mine?" "The Queen's?" "Maybe we're all part of someone's dream." Before Alice could ponder this philosophical question, the Queen announced that it was time for the trial. Although no one knew exactly what crime would be tried or who would be accused. "Everyone in a court," ordered the Queen. "And remember, sentence first, verdict later." Alice sighed, realizing that she was about to witness yet another demonstration of the inverted logic of Wonderland. As she followed the royal procession towards the courthouse, she couldn't help but think how her tedious afternoon of studying had turned into such an extraordinary adventure. The royal court was an even more chaotic scene than the croquet match. Jurors of all shapes and sizes, from small lizards to large birds, settled into their seats, while the king and queen sat on elevated thrones. The White Rabbit, now the royal herald, blew his trumpet nervously. "Silence in the court," announced the rabbit, unrolling a scroll. "Today's case, the theft of the queen's strawberry tarts." Alice watched as they brought in the accused, the Jack of Hearts, who looked more confused than guilty. The king adjusted his crown and began to read out the charges, although his voice could barely be heard over the noise of the jurors taking notes on their slates. "As a witness," called out the rabbit, "we summon the Mad Hatter." The Hatter entered holding a cup of tea, still trembling. The Queen looked at him sternly. "Take off your hat." "I can't," replied the Hatter. "It's not mine." "Stealed," cried the Queen. "No, your majesty," he explained. "I sell them. I'm a hatter." The confusion increased when the Hatter began to tell a completely unrelated story about his last tea with the March Hare. The Queen turned redder and redder, while the King frantically jotted down in his little notebook, "Don't mention tea again, too provocative." Alice, who had grown a little during the proceedings, probably due to a cookie she had absent-mindedly eaten, began to realize the absurdity of that trial. No one had really proved that the pies were stolen, or even that they existed. The next to testify was the Duchess's cook, who only talked about pepper and turtle soup, causing a series of collective sneezes in the courtroom. The Cheshire Cat appeared and disappeared among the jurors, making ironic comments that made the Queen even angrier. "Order! Order in the court!" shouted the king, banging his gavel, which, for some reason, was made of jelly. The confusion reached its peak when they called the next witness, a talking pie. "How can a pie testify?" wondered Alice aloud, momentarily forgetting where she was. "How can a girl who changes size question the logic of a talking pie?" replied the Cheshire Cat, appearing next to her. The tart began her testimony by singing a song about cherries and cream, which somehow turned into a story about a bat drinking tea with an umbrella. The judges were frantically taking notes, although Alice doubted that any of them understood what was going on. "Proof," shouted the queen. "Present the evidence." The White Rabbit brought out an empty envelope. "This is the most conclusive proof we've ever had," he declared solemnly. "How can an empty envelope be proof?" asked Alice, again forgetting to keep quiet. "If there was something inside," explained the king patiently, "it wouldn't be proof of the theft because the pies would have been found. The fact that there is nothing is proof that they were stolen." Alice tried to process this tortuous logic as the trial continued. The dodo was called to testify and insisted on holding a race in committee inside the courtroom to demonstrate his point of view, whatever it was. The situation became even more confusing when the Duchess appeared with her baby pig, who started squealing so loudly that no one could hear her. The Hatter took advantage of the confusion to serve tea to all the jurors, who began to float due to some strange ingredient in the drink. "Order, order," shouted the king, now using his jelly hammer to try to reach the floating jurors. "To hell with order," declared the queen. "Cut off their heads. All of them." It was at this point that Alice, who had grown even bigger during the chaos, decided she'd had enough. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "You're just a deck of cards." A deathly silence fell over the court. The queen, whose face was now purple with rage, pointed a trembling finger at Alice. "Cut her head, OFF." The cards began to fly towards her, spinning in the air like leaves in a storm. Alice, now the size of a house, tried to push them away with her hands, but they kept coming, buzzing around her like a swarm of angry wasps. "You're nothing but a deck of cards," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, as the cards continued their frenzied attack. The White Rabbit blew his trumpet in panic, the Hatter hid inside his teacup, and the Cheshire Cat watched everything with his eternal enigmatic smile. The confusion grew by the second, with the cards flying higher and higher, the queen shouting impossible orders, and the king desperately trying to restore order with his now melting jelly hammer. Alice felt she was losing control of the situation, but something inside her told her that this nonsense had to end. Amidst the growing chaos of the courtroom, Alice felt a strange sense of clarity. The cards continued to fly around her, but their movements seemed slower and slower, as if they were moving through honey. The Cheshire Cat's smile hung in the air like a crescent moon, and his words echoed in Alice's mind. "We're all mad here. This has to stop," thought Alice, and the moment this thought formed, the world around her began to ripple like the surface of a disturbed lake. The colors of Wonderland began to blend together like a wet watercolor. The furious red of the queen, the vibrant green of the garden, the deep blue of the impossible sky. The queen was still shouting orders, but her voice sounded distant now, as if it came from inside a very long tunnel. The Mad Hatter emerged from his teacup only to start a new story about why a crow looks like a desk, while the March Hare clapped enthusiastically, throwing cookies everywhere. "But it doesn't make sense," protested Alice, watching the cookies turn into butterflies before they hit the ground. "Of course it makes sense," replied the Cheshire Cat, fully materializing for the first time. "You're just trying to find sense where nonsense reigns. Sometimes, dear Alice, the only sensible thing to do is to embrace the madness." The cat's words made Alice reflect on her entire journey. From the moment she followed the White Rabbit, she had tried to apply the logic of her world to this extraordinary place. Now she realized that perhaps true wisdom lay in accepting that not everything had to make sense. The courtroom had turned into a veritable carnival of absurdities. The floating jurors began to sing in harmony with the tart witness, while the king tried to maintain order using his jelly gave Lynn as a baton. The Duchess danced a waltz with her baby pig, who now wore a powdered wig and recited poetry in Latin. "You're all mad," declared Alice, but this time there was a smile in her voice. "Ah, now you understand," exclaimed the Mad Hatter, pouring tea in cups that floated through the air. "We're all mad here, even you, my dear. After all, what sane person would follow a dressed-up rabbit?" Alice couldn't help but laugh. It was true. She had chosen to follow the White Rabbit. She had chosen to drink from mysterious bottles and eat magical cakes. Every decision she made led her deeper into this wonderful, absurd world. The cards that were still flying around her began to turn into flowers, their sharp edges softening into delicate petals. The Queen of Hearts, seeing her authority literally blossom, was so surprised that her crown slipped and started spinning like a top. "Impossible," cried the Queen. "Nothing is impossible," replied Alice serenely. "Only improbable." The White Rabbit, still checking his watch, began to shrink in size until he was just a small white dot on the horizon. The clock in his paws turned into a soap bubble that floated upwards, taking with it all the worries about being late. The false tortoise and the griffin began an elaborate dance, dragging other characters into their chaotic choreography. Soon, the whole court was involved in a surreal quadrille, with the dodo calling out the steps in a language no one understood, but everyone seemed to know exactly what to do. "See," said the Cheshire Cat, now dancing upside down in the air. "When you stop trying to make sense of things, they start to make sense by themselves." Alice watched in amazement as Wonderland began to dissolve around her, not in a frightening way, but like a dream gently coming to an end. The colors began to soften, the sounds became more distant, and she felt a deep peace come over her. "It's time to wake up," whispered the cat, his smile being the last thing to disappear. Alice opened her eyes slowly, finding herself once again under the tree where it had all begun. Her sister was still there, the storybook on her lap, looking at her curiously. "You slept for a long time," said her sister. "You must have had some interesting dreams." Alice smiled, sitting up and fixing her blue dress. The daisies were still dancing in the afternoon breeze, and in the distance, she could have sworn she saw a white rabbit scurrying among the flowers. "You know," said Alice thoughtfully, "I think I've learned something important today." "And what would that be?" asked her sister. "That sometimes the most senseless things make the most sense of all," replied Alice. "And that there's nothing wrong with being a little crazy once in a while." Her sister laughed, closing the history book. "You say the strangest things sometimes, Alice." "Yes," agreed Alice, smiling as she watched a butterfly that seemed to be winking at her. "And isn't it wonderful?" The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with colors vaguely reminiscent of Wonderland. Alice stood up, shaking the leaves from her dress, ready to go home. But she knew that a part of her would always remain in that extraordinary world where rabbits wear watches, cats can disappear, and a cup of tea is always an adventure waiting to happen. And so ended Alice's adventure in Wonderland. But as the Cheshire Cat might say, no story ever really ends. It just continues in a different way, somewhere else, waiting to be discovered again. The icy wind blew across the plains of Pine Ridge, carrying with it the ancestral lament that echoed in the memories of the Lakota people. Sarah Swift Eagle, a 17-year-old girl, watched the orange horizon of dusk as her grandfather, Joseph Sacred Cloud, prepared the sacred pipe for the evening ceremony. The sweet aroma of traditional tobacco mingled with the sage that burned slowly beside them. "Grandpa, tell me again about White Buffalo Calf Woman," Sarah asked, her dark eyes reflecting the same curiosity she had as a child. Joseph smiled, the wrinkles on his face telling stories of many winters lived as he adjusted his traditional blanket over his shoulders. "A long time ago, when our people were going through great hardship, 2 young warriors went out hunting," he began, his deep voice carrying the weight of the story. "On their journey, they met a beautiful woman dressed in white, who was carrying a sacred package. One of the warriors had impure thoughts about her and was turned to dust. The other, respectful, was spared and instructed to return to the village to prepare his people for her arrival." Sarah knew the story by heart, but each time she heard it, new details seemed to emerge, like water flowing from an ancient spring. The reserve was facing difficult times. Drought was punishing the land, traditions were being lost among the young people, and poverty was growing like weeds in fertile soil. "The signs are everywhere," Joseph continued, pointing to a group of clouds forming in the sky. "The prophecies speak of his return in times of great need, when the people need to find their way back to harmony." At school, Sarah faced the daily challenge of balancing 2 worlds, that of Lakota traditions and that of modern society. Her classmates often mocked her beliefs, especially Tommy Redfeather, who had completely abandoned traditional customs in favor of the dominant culture. The community was divided. Some, like his Aunt Martha Crescent Moon, insisted that salvation would come through modernization and the abandonment of old superstitions. Others, like her grandfather, remained steadfast in preserving ancestral teachings. That night, as the moon rose in the starry sky, a group gathered in the community center to discuss the growing crisis in the reserve. The drought had destroyed most of the crops, and government resources were scarce. Sarah watched from the doorway as voices rose in disagreement. "We have to accept the mining company's proposal," argued Martha, her gray hair tied up in a tight bun. "They've offered jobs, money to the community. We can't live on old dreams and stories." Joseph stood up slowly, the sacred pipe in his hands. "What we were taught by white buffalo calf women are not just stories." His voice was calm but firm. "They're the foundations of who we are. The land is not something we can sell or trade. It is our sacred responsibility." Sarah felt the weight of the conflict in her heart. Her best friend, Lisa Chavasuave, had lost her father to alcoholism the year before, a disease that affected many on the reservation. The old stories spoke of healing and harmony, but how could they help with such modern and complex problems? During the meeting, an elder called David Swifthorse shared a vision he had had. "I saw a white buffalo in the hills," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "And it wasn't alone. It was followed by other buffalo, bringing life back to the dry grasslands." Some laughed quietly, others listened reverently. Sarah, however, felt something different, a deep connection with the elder's words. She remembered the strange dream she had been having over the last few weeks. Visions of buffalo running under a stormy sky and a mysterious woman who seemed to be calling her. After the meeting, while helping her grandfather put away the sacred objects, Sarah shared her dreams with him. Joseph listened attentively, his eyes shining with ancient knowledge. "Dreams are messages, little one," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "White buffalo calf woman didn't just teach us rituals and prayers. She showed us that everything is connected, the past, the present, and the future. The problems we face today are no different from those our ancestors faced. The solution has always been to maintain balance." That night, lying in her bed, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. Through the window, she could see the stars shining brightly in the dark sky. A gentle wind entered the room, bringing with it the scent of sage and prairie grass. In her mind, her grandfather's words mingled with the old stories and modern problems of the reservation. Before falling asleep, Sarah had a strong feeling that something important was about to happen. The prophecy spoke of white buffalo calf woman returning in times of need, and these were certainly difficult times. But how would she recognize the signs? And more importantly, how could she help her people find their way back to the harmony they so desperately needed? Sleep slowly enveloped her, and in her dreams she once again saw a buffalo running free across the plains. This time, however, they weren't just distant visions. They seemed more real, closer, as if they were crossing the border between the world of dreams and reality. And in front of them, glistening like the first snow of winter, ran a white buffalo. The next morning brought with it a dense fog that covered Pine Ridge like a protective cloak. Sarah woke up still feeling the vivid effects of her dream about the buffalo. As she got ready for school, she noticed something different in the air, a peculiar silence that seemed charged with expectation. At breakfast, his mother, Helen Gentle Wind, was preparing traditional corn fritters, the comforting aroma filling the small kitchen. "You seem distant today," Helen observed, noticing her daughter's pensive gaze. Sarah hesitated before sharing her dreams, knowing that her mother, although respectful of traditions, was more pragmatic than her grandfather. "I've had strange dreams, Mom, about buffalo and something else I can't quite explain." Helen stopped what she was doing, her hands suspended over the dough. For a moment, Sarah saw something flash through her mother's eyes. Recognition, perhaps concern. "Your grandmother had dreams like that," Helen said softly, returning to her work. Before she left, she talked a lot about signs and visions. "Your grandfather believed her, but I was too young to understand. At school, Sarah met Lisa's soft rain in the corridor. Her friend seemed more excited than usual, her eyes shining with restrained excitement. "You won't believe it," whispered Lisa, pulling Sarah into a corner. "My Uncle Robert saw something strange in the hills last night. He says there were lights dancing over the prairies, just like the old stories said." Before they could continue the conversation, Tommy Red Feather walked past them, purposely bumping into Sarah. Still believing in fairy tales, Swift Eagle, he teased, a mocking smile on his face. But Sarah noticed something different in his eyes, a shade of unease that didn't match his usual arrogance. During history class, while the teacher was discussing the colonization of the American West, Sarah couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts wandered to the stories her grandfather told about White Buffalo Calf Woman, about how she had appeared in a time of great need. The reservation was certainly going through hard times right now. At lunch break, a group of students gathered in the courtyard, commenting on strange events that had been happening. Ginny Ivers Kalmas, a senior, said that her father, one of the tribal counselors, had found mysterious footprints near the dry creek. Footprints too large to be those of any known animal in the area. Sarah was observing the discussion when she noticed Tommy sitting alone under a tree. Something in his solitary posture made her approach him, putting aside her resentment of the previous provocations. "Is everything all right?" she asked, taking a seat next to him. Tommy remained silent for a moment, playing with a beaded bracelet that Sarah had never noticed before. "My grandmother passed away last week," he finally said, his voice low and vulnerable. "Before she left, she gave me this." He held out the bracelet. It was beautifully handcrafted with traditional Lakota patterns. "She said that times of change were coming and that I would need to remember who I am." Tommy's confession took Sarah by surprise. Beneath his facade of modernity and disdain for old ways, there was a connection to his roots that he tried to deny. "You know," Sarah said gently, "my grandfather always says that our traditions are not chains that bind us to the past, but roots that give us the strength to grow." After school, Sarah decided to visit the Reserve's Cultural Center, where her Aunt Martha worked. She found her organizing documents about the mining company's proposal, her face tense with worry. "Sarah, dear," Martha smiled tiredly, "have you come help me with the paperwork?" "Actually, Annie, I came to ask about Grandma. Mom mentioned something about her having special dreams." Martha put the papers aside, a faraway look in her eyes. "Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman. She saw things that others couldn't. Before the great flood of '97, she dreamt of rising waters. No one believed her, but she insisted that we prepare shelters. It saved many lives." While Martha was talking, Sarah noticed movement through the window. A group of elders were gathering in the community center, including her grandfather and David Fasthorse. There was an urgency in their movements that caught her attention. "Something's happening," murmured Martha, also observing. "The elders don't get together like this for no reason." Sarah said goodbye to her aunt and ran to the community center. Through the ajar door, she could hear voices arguing in Lakota. Her grandfather noticed her presence and beckoned her in. "The signs are multiplying," said David Swifthorse, his voice shaking with emotion. "Not just the lights on the hills and the mysterious footprints. The birds are returning to the dry grasslands, and this morning we found green shoots where nothing had grown for months." Joseph picked up the sacred pipe, his movements deliberate and precise. White Buffalo Calf Woman taught us that renewal comes through connection, with the land, with each other, with our ancestors. Perhaps it's time to bring the people together for a great ceremony. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The elder's words echoed her own feelings, visions, and dreams. Something was changing on Pine Ridge, something that went beyond disputes over mining or modernization. It was as if the land itself was awakening from a long sleep. At nightfall, as he walked home with his grandfather, the wind began to change. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, bringing with them the distant smell of rain, an aroma almost forgotten in the parched prairies. "The times of change have come, little one," said Joseph, watching the sky. "And you, like your grandmother before you, have an important role to play." Sarah looked up at the approaching clouds, feeling the weight of her grandfather's words. In her mind, the buffaloes of her dreams kept running, and now they seemed closer than ever. The storm forming on the horizon finally reached Pine Ridge, bringing with it some long-awaited rain. Sarah watched the drops through her bedroom window, while listening to the excited voices of the neighbors celebrating outside. It was as if nature itself was responding to the recent events on the reservation. The next morning, the earth exuded that unique scent of rain and wet soil. Sarah found her grandfather in the yard, examining small green shoots that had sprung up during the night. "It's as if the earth is waking up," he said, gently touching one of the tender leaves. At school, the buzz was constant. The unexpected rain had brought hope, and even the most skeptical were beginning to question recent events. Tommy, who normally kept his distance from Sarah, approached her during break time. "My grandmother used to say that when rain comes after a long drought, it's a sign that the spirits are watching," he said, his voice low and hesitant. Sarah noticed that he was still wearing the beaded bracelet, now more visible on his wrist. Lisa joined them, bringing even more intriguing news. "Did you hear? They found huge footprints near the old stream, where the water started flowing again. And they're not just the footprints of an animal. They seem to form a pattern, as if they were dancing." The news spread quickly through the reserve. After school, a sizable group of people gathered near the stream. Sarah accompanied her grandfather there, watching as the elders examined the mysterious marks in the damp soil. "These are the same ones that appear in the old stories," murmured David Swifthorse, kneeling down to touch the prints. "The sacred patterns that white buffalo calf woman taught our people." Aunt Martha was also present, her usual skepticism giving way to an expression of astonishment. "This can't be the work of vandals or bromists," she admitted, studying the intricate markings. "No one knows these patterns in such detail, except those who have kept the ancient teachings," Joseph added, exchanging a meaningful glance with the other elders. That evening, the tribal council called an emergency meeting. The room was packed, with people of all ages and different views on the traditions. Sarah noticed that even those who normally avoided traditional events were present. "The mining company has increased its offer," Martha announced, presenting new documents. "They know about the rain and the signs, and they're afraid we'll lose interest in the deal." A murmur went through the room. Joseph stood up slowly, carrying the sacred pipe. "Our ancestors taught us that land is not something we can sell. What we are witnessing are the signs that were prophesied. White buffalo calf woman is reminding us of our true wealth." To everyone's surprise, Tommy stood up. His voice trembled slightly, but his words were firm. "My grandmother told me, before she left, that we would see signs of renewal. She said we would need to choose between following the path of money or the path of ancient wisdom." Sarah felt her heart racing. Her dreams of the buffalo were becoming more vivid every night, and now she was beginning to understand their meaning. They were not just symbols of the past, but messages for the present and future. The discussion went on into the night, with different voices and opinions being expressed. Some still defended the mining company's proposal, arguing that the money could bring practical improvements to the community. Others, inspired by recent events, spoke of returning to traditional farming and conservation practices. While the adults debated, Sarah noticed a group of young people gathered outside. Lisa, Tommy, and other teenagers were talking quietly, sharing their own experiences of recent dreams and visions. "It's like something is calling us back," said Jenny Comwaters. "Yesterday, I dreamed about my great-grandmother, who I've never met. She was dancing with buffalo under a starry sky." The group decided to form a youth circle to study ancient traditions. Tommy, to everyone's amazement, offered his house for the meetings. "My grandmother left a lot of books and articles about her culture. I think it's time to really get to know them." Sarah shared her dreams with the group, describing the buffalo and the sense of urgency she felt. Everyone had their own story to tell, their own connections to the past that were beginning to awaken. Meanwhile, at the adults' meeting, an important decision was being made. The tribal council voted unanimously to postpone any decision on the mining company's proposal until the signs had been properly interpreted and understood. "Our young people are showing the way," declared David Swifthorse, observing the group gathered outside. "They are the bridge between the old and the new." Joseph smiled as he saw his granddaughter at the center of the circle of young people. her voice clear and confident as she shared the stories he had taught her. White Buffalo Calf Woman showed us that renewal comes through generations, he said. The cycle continues. The night progressed, and with it, more rain clouds approached. The air was charged not only with humidity, but with possibilities. Something was changing in Pine Ridge, something that went beyond earthly disputes and everyday worries. Sarah felt a gentle breeze touch her face, carrying with it the scent of sage and wet grass. In her mind, the buffalo continued their eternal dance across the prairies. But now she was no longer alone in her vision. Others were also beginning to see, to dream, to remember. The ancient prophecy spoke of a time of renewal, when White Buffalo Calf Woman would return to lead her people back to harmony. As she watched the raindrops begin to fall again, Sarah realized that perhaps this time would not be a one-off moment, but a gradual awakening, a return to the wisdom that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. The rain continued for several days, transforming the arid landscape of Pine Ridge. The streams began to flow again, and the prairies began to show shades of green that had not been seen for a long time. The group of young people led by Sarah continued to meet regularly at Tommy's house, where the old stories took on new life through their voices. At one of these meetings, while they were studying the meanings of the sacred symbols, Lisa arrived breathless with some surprising news. "You have to see this," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. "There's a group of wild buffalo in the northern hills." The news spread like wildfire through the reserve. Buffalo hadn't been seen in the area for decades. Joseph and the other elders organized an expedition to check it out, and Sarah insisted on accompanying them. Tommy, overcoming his earlier hesitation, also offered to go. At dawn, the small group set off towards the hills. The air was fresh and clean after the rains, and the rising sun painted the sky in vibrant colors. As they walked, Joseph shared stories about how his ancestors lived in harmony with the buffalo. Every part of the buffalo had a sacred purpose, he explained, not just for food, but for tools, clothing, shelter. They taught us about not wasting, about respecting life in all its forms. After a few hours of walking, David the swift horse signaled for the group to stop. In the valley below, grazing peacefully, was a small herd of buffalo. Sarah felt her heart race. The scene was just like in her dreams. "Look," whispered Tommy, pointing to something moving among the animals. A young buffalo, its pure white coat shining in the morning sun, stood out from the rest of the herd. The silence that followed was deep and reverent. Joseph lit the sacred pipe, blowing smoke in all four directions. "It's no coincidence," he said softly. "The signs are coming together." Back at the reserve, the news of the buffalo, and especially the white buffalo, caused quite a stir. Martha called an emergency meeting of the tribal council, but this time the tone was different. Instead of discussing the mining company's proposal, the conversation centered on how to protect the land where the buffalo had returned. "We can't ignore the significance of this," she declared, surprising everyone with her change of position. "Maybe it's time to reconsider our priorities." The young people in the study group began organizing story-sharing sessions with the younger children in the community. Sarah watched with pride as Tommy, once so resistant to traditions, enthusiastically taught them about the meanings of sacred symbols. Lisa brought her grandmother to one of the meetings, a lady who had rarely left the house since the death of her son. The old woman cried when she saw the young people so interested in the ancient traditions. "It's as if the circle is closing," she said, her trembling hands holding Lisa's. One day, while Sarah was helping her grandfather prepare medicinal herbs, he shared something he had kept for a long time. "Your grandmother had a vision before she left," he revealed. "She saw young people gathered in a circle, bringing new life to old forms. She saw a girl, you, Sarah, serving as a bridge between the worlds." The revelation touched Sarah deeply. Her recent dreams had become clearer, showing not just the buffalo, but scenes of healing and renewal for her community. She shared these visions with the youth group, and together they began to plan concrete actions to help the reserve. They started a community garden project, using traditional cultivation methods that Joseph and other elders had taught them. Tommy surprised everyone by using his knowledge of technology to document the ancient techniques, creating a digital archive of oral traditions with the permission of the elders. The presence of the buffalo in the hills attracted the attention of the media and conservation groups. Reporters started showing up at the reserve, interested in the story of the return of the sacred animals. Sarah and her friends saw this as an opportunity to share their culture in a respectful and authentic way. "It's not just about the buffalo coming back," Sarah explained to a journalist. "It's about remembering who we are and finding a way to live in harmony with the land again." The mining company tried one last time to influence the community's decision by offering an even larger sum. But something had fundamentally changed in Pine Ridge. The tribal council, with the unanimous support of the community, definitively rejected the proposal. "Our wealth is not in what we can extract from the land," Martha declared during the vote, "but in how we can live in balance with it, as we were taught." One evening, as the group of young people gathered around a campfire, sharing stories and dreams, Sarah realized that something bigger was happening. It wasn't just about preserving the past, but about creating a future that honored both ancient traditions and the needs of the present. "White Buffalo Calf Woman taught us that renewal comes through connection," she told the group. "Maybe that's what we're experiencing now. Not just the return of something old, but the birth of something new." The white buffalo continued to be seen in the hills, as a constant reminder of the sacred presence that guided their people. And with each passing day, more signs of renewal appeared on Pine Ridge, not only in the land that was once again flourishing, but in the hearts and minds of its people who were rediscovering their ancestral strength and wisdom. The transformation of Pine Ridge continued in a subtle but profound way. The community gardens flourished under the dedicated care of young people and elders working side by side. Sarah noticed how the project had become more than just growing food. It was a living symbol of the renewal her community was experiencing. Tommy, who once mocked traditions, now led workshops on green technology, combining ancestral knowledge with modern, sustainable solutions. His project to digitally document oral histories had grown, attracting interest from other reserves and even universities. "It's amazing how much everything has changed," Lisa commented as she helped Sarah harvest medicinal herbs. "Remember when we thought we had to choose between being modern or traditional? Now I see that we can be both." The herd of buffalo in the hills had become permanently established, and the white buffalo continued to be seen regularly as a silent guardian of the land. Researchers who came to study the phenomenon were intrigued not only by the unlikely return of the animals, but also by the ecological revitalization that accompanied them. Joseph began organizing regular walks with the young people to a safe observation point where they could see the buffalo and learn about their cultural and ecological importance. "Each buffalo is like a prayer in motion," he explained. "Their feet work the earth, their mouths spread seeds, their dung nourishes the soil. They teach us about the sacred cycle of life." News of Pine Ridge's transformation began to spread. Other indigenous communities sent representatives to learn about how the reservation had managed to balance tradition and progress. Sarah and her friends often found themselves sharing their experiences with curious visitors. Martha, who had previously fiercely defended modernization at any cost, became one of the most vocal advocates of the community's new path. She worked tirelessly to establish partnerships with environmental conservation and sustainable development organizations. "I realized I was looking for solutions in the wrong places," she confessed during a council meeting. "The real strength has always been here, in our own wisdom." One day, while Sarah was walking alone through the now green prairies, she found familiar footprints, the same mysterious marks that had appeared months before. Following them, she came to a small clearing where a white buffalo grazed serenely. For a moment, their eyes met, and Sarah felt a deep connection with something greater than herself. That evening, during a special ceremony, David Swifthorse shared a new vision. "I saw our young people leading the way for other communities," he said, his voice charged with emotion. "What's happening here is just the beginning." The youth study group had grown into a larger movement. They began organizing cultural festivals that attracted people from all over, celebrating not only Lakota traditions, but also finding ways to apply them to contemporary challenges. It's like White Buffalo Calf Woman is showing us a new way, Sarah reflected during one of these celebrations. Not just to go back to the past, but to create a future that honors all aspects of who we are. The community began to thrive in unexpected ways. Traditional knowledge about medicinal plants, combined with sustainable cultivation practices, led to the development of an herbal cooperative that generated income for families. The young people found ways to use technology to preserve and share ancestral knowledge, creating bridges between worlds that had previously seemed irreconcilable. Tommy, who had become one of the most dedicated scholars of the traditions, often said, "My grandmother was right about the choice we had to make, but it wasn't between money and tradition. It was between remaining divided or finding our own way of healing." The changes at Pine Ridge have not gone unnoticed by the outside world. Journalists, researchers, and environmental activists began visiting the reserve, interested in learning how a community had managed to turn a crisis into an opportunity for renewal. Sarah, now recognized as a young leader in her community, often found herself explaining to visitors that the real miracle was not in the extraordinary events that had occurred, but in the way people had chosen to respond to them. White Buffalo Calf Woman taught us that everything is connected, she said. When we remember this, we begin to see that the healing of our land, our community, and ourselves are all parts of the same journey. The white buffalo continued to appear in the hills, no longer as an omen of change, but as a constant reminder of the path they had chosen. The children of the reserve grew up hearing not only the old stories, but also witnessing how these stories were given new life through the actions of their community. One quiet afternoon, as Sarah and her grandfather watched the sun set over the revitalized prairies, Joseph smiled with satisfaction. "White Buffalo Calf Woman promised to return in times of need," he said. Perhaps a return was not a single event, but something that happens whenever we choose to remember who we really are. Sarah nodded, finally understanding the true meaning of her dreams and visions. The renewal that White Buffalo Calf Woman had prophesied was not just a return to the past, but an awakening to a new way of being, one that honored the old traditions while embracing the possibilities of the present. The prairies of Pine Ridge continued to flourish, and with them, the hope of a future where old wisdoms and new ways could coexist in harmony. The Lakota people had rediscovered their strength, not only in the stories of the past, but in the courage to create their own history, one chapter at a time. Flames consumed Troy, dyeing the night sky red as desperate cries echoed through the once majestic streets. Aeneas, a Trojan prince and respected warrior, watched his hometown succumb to the Greek siege with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The famous wooden horse, which hours before had been celebrated as a gift from the gods, had turned out to be a death trap, unleashing Greek soldiers who were now massacring his people. In the midst of the chaos, Aeneas carried his elderly father, Anchises, on his shoulders. The old man's weight was considerable, but the prince's determination was greater. Beside him, his little son Ascanius clung to his tunic, his wide eyes reflecting the terror of the destruction around him. The thick smoke made breathing difficult, and the heat from the flames was almost unbearable. "Father, we need to hurry," whispered Aeneas, adjusting Anchises' weight as he led his family through narrow alleyways, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the battle was still raging. His wife Creusa followed close behind, but fate had other plans for her. In the confusion of their escape, her silhouette disappeared into the darkness, a moment that would haunt Aeneas for years to come. As they escaped through the ruined city, divine visions began to manifest themselves. Venus, Aeneas' divine mother, appeared in a golden flash, her words echoing with supernatural authority. "My son, your destiny does not end with Troy. The gods have chosen you for a greater mission, to found a new civilization that will surpass even the glory of Priam." The words of his divine mother resounded in his mind as he led the survivors to the port. A small group of loyal Trojans had managed to prepare ships for the escape and were now waiting for their leader. The sea, black as ink under the blazing sky, promised an escape but also unknown dangers. On Olympus, the gods watched with varied interest. While Venus protected her son, Juno, Jupiter's powerful wife, simmered with hatred. Her aversion to the Trojans, fueled by ancient prophecies and rivalries, led her to swear that she would make Aeneas' journey an endless torment. As he embarked with his companions, Aeneas took one last look at Troy. The city that had once been the symbol of greatness and civilization was now nothing but smoking ruins. Silent tears streamed down his face as he held Ascanius close to his chest, silently promising that he would find a new home for his people. The sea welcomed them with a deceptive calm. The makeshift fleet of Trojan ships began their journey under a gradually brightening sky. But Aeneas knew the peace wouldn't last. Juno was already moving her pieces, summoning Aeolus, Lord of the Winds, to unleash storms that would test the refugees' resolve. Among the survivors was Achates, Aeneas' closest friend and most trusted advisor. "Where are we going?" he asked, looking at the uncertain horizon. Aeneas, contemplating the prophecies and visions he had received, replied with a conviction he didn't fully feel. "To the west, where the gods have promised our new land." The initial days at sea were marked by a mixture of mourning and hope. The Trojans mourned their dead while trying to keep their traditions and rituals alive. Anchises, though weakened, became a source of wisdom and consolation, recounting ancient prophecies that spoke of a new Troy rising from the ashes of the old one. Ascanius, still too young to fully understand the magnitude of his loss, adapted to life at sea with the resilience characteristic of children. Aeneas watched his son with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing that the future they sought would depend a lot on this little prince. At night, when most people rested, Aeneas stayed awake on deck, studying the stars and looking for signs of the gods. The constellations seemed different from the ones he knew in Troy, as if even the sky wanted to remind him that there was no turning back. In his moments of solitude, he thought of Creusa and all those who had been left behind. The ships continued their journey west, while rumors and stories circulated among the crew about distant lands and unknown peoples. Some spoke of Carthage, a prosperous city ruled by a widowed queen. Others mentioned the mysterious Italian peninsula, where ancient prophecies said the Trojans would meet their fate. But before they could contemplate much about their fate, Juno decided to act. The clouds began to gather on the horizon, first as small white flakes, then as dark, threatening masses. The sea, until then relatively calm, began to churn with a supernatural fury. Aeneas realized that his journey had only just begun and that each day would bring new challenges. As he prepared his crew for the coming storm, he silently renewed his commitment to the mission the gods had entrusted to him. The future of his people, the promise of a new civilization, and the fate of his son depended on his ability to persevere. The first gale hit the ships with brutal force, marking the beginning of a series of trials that would test not only the Trojans' nautical skills, but also their faith in the gods and their leader. Aeneas, standing at the bow of his ship, faced the rising waves with the determination of a man who had already lost everything once and was willing to fight to the end for a new beginning. The storm sent by Juno grew in intensity, turning the Mediterranean Sea into a battlefield between the Trojan ships and the forces of nature. Gigantic waves rose up like liquid walls, threatening to swallow up the entire fleet. Aeneas, clinging to the tiller of his ship, struggled to maintain control as he watched with growing despair the other ships being scattered by the fury of the elements. "Father of the gods, help us," he shouted amid the roar of the storm, his words almost lost in the howling wind. Ascanius was safe below deck with Anchises, but several of his men were thrown overboard by the merciless waves. Achates desperately coordinated efforts to rescue the fallen sailors, while others struggled to keep the sails intact. On Olympus, Neptune noticed Juno's interference in his domain. Angry at the intrusion into his seas, the god of the oceans emerged from the depths in his chariot pulled by seahorses. With a wave of his trident, he began to calm the waters, rebuking the winds that had dared to disturb his kingdom without his permission. Gradually, the storm subsided, leaving behind a drastically reduced and dispersed fleet. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, Aeneas could assess the damage. Of the 20 ships that had set sail from Troy, only 7 remained in sight. The Trojan prince's heart was heavy at the loss of so many compatriots, but there was no time for prolonged mourning. The surviving ships found refuge in a bay near the north coast of Africa. It was a natural cove, protected by rocky cliffs that stood like silent sentinels. The Trojans, exhausted and drenched, began to disembark on the beach, thanking the gods for having survived Juno's fury. Aeneas, showing his characteristic leadership, immediately organized search parties to hunt and collect supplies. Others were assigned to repair the damaged ships, while a third group set up a temporary camp. Ascanius, always curious, explored the beach under the watchful eye of his grandfather Anchises, who took advantage of his time off to interpret the divine signs. During one of their hunting expeditions, Aeneas and Achates found signs of civilization. Not far from the coast, smoke was rising through the trees, indicating the presence of a city. It was Carthage, although they didn't know it yet, a city under construction under the command of the determined Queen Dido. Venus, ever vigilant about the fate of her son, decided to intervene. Disguised as a young huntress, she appeared before Aeneas and Achates, revealing to them the history of Carthage and its queen. Dido, a Phoenician princess who had fled from her tyrant brother, had established a new kingdom on the African coast, attracting followers and building a city that promised to rival the greatest in the known world. "The queen will understand your situation," said Venus, her eyes shining with divine knowledge. "She also knows the weight of leading a people in exile." Before disappearing in a golden aura, the goddess enveloped Aeneas in a magical mist that would make him invisible, allowing him to observe Carthage unnoticed. Aeneas and Achates approached the city under construction, amazed at the energy and organization they found. Workers were erecting monumental walls. Others were paving streets and building temples. It was a sight reminiscent of the ancient glory of Troy, awakening in Aeneas bittersweet memories of his lost home. In the center of the city, they found a temple dedicated to Juno, its walls already decorated with murals telling the story of the fall of Troy. Aeneas stopped, moved, to see depictions of battles in which he himself had fought. "Even here our fame precedes us," he muttered to Achates. "There are places in the world where our struggles are known and our pain is understood." Venus' protective mist dissipated as Dido entered the temple to conduct the day's business. The queen was an impressive figure, combining beauty and natural authority. Her regal bearing and determined expression spoke of someone who, like Aeneas, had overcome great adversity to lead her people to a new beginning. When Aeneas revealed himself, introducing himself and his people, Dido immediately recognized the opportunity that lay ahead. Carthage could benefit from the Trojans' strength and skill, while offering them a safe haven. "Welcome to Carthage," she declared, her voice carrying both authority and compassion. "We know well the trials of Troy, and here you will find shelter." News of Dido's hospitality quickly spread among the Trojans camped on the beach. Soon, arrangements were made to accommodate the refugees within the walls of the city under construction. The Trojans, accustomed to hard work and discipline, quickly integrated themselves into the construction effort, contributing their experience and manpower. As the days turned into weeks, a routine began to establish itself. The Trojans found a temporary purpose helping to build Carthage, while Dido and Aeneas spent more and more time together, discussing matters of government and sharing stories of their respective journeys. A natural closeness began to develop between them, although neither would admit it at first. Anchises, watching events unfold with the wisdom of years, began to express concern. "We mustn't forget our destiny," he reminded Aeneas during a quiet night. "The gods have promised us a new land in Italy. Carthage may be welcoming, but it's not our final destination." As Carthage grew, so did the attraction between Dido and Aeneas. The queen found in the Trojan prince not only a valuable ally, but someone who understood the weight of leadership and the scars of exile. During the evening banquets in the royal palace, Dido drank in every word of the stories Aeneas told about the fall of Troy and his perilous journey across the sea. "Tell me more about your city," she would often ask, her eyes shining in the torchlight. And Aeneas would talk, reliving painful memories, but finding solace in the understanding he saw on the queen's face. The evenings stretched into long conversations, and the servants noticed how their queen seemed more alive, more radiant in the presence of the Trojan prince. Cupid, at Venus' request, had planted the seed of love in Dido's heart, ensuring that the Trojans would find protection in Carthage. The little god of love, disguised as Ascanius, had touched the queen with his enchanted arrows during one of the first banquets. Now that seed was blossoming into a deep and dangerous feeling. The days in Carthage took on a rhythm of their own. The Trojans took an active part in building the city, their skills in architecture and engineering proving invaluable. Aeneas often supervised the work alongside Dido, discussing plans for fortifications and temples. Their shoulders would sometimes touch during these inspections, sending shivers through both their bodies. Ascanius thrived in his new environment, making friends among the Carthaginian children and learning their games and customs. Anchises, meanwhile, became increasingly restless. At night, the old man studied the omens and consulted the oracles, all of which pointed to Italy as the Trojans' true destiny. "The gods didn't bring us this far to settle here," he warned Aeneas in private conversations. "Every day we spend in Carthage, we move further away from our divine destiny." His words weighed heavily on Aeneas' heart, as he found himself torn between duty and his growing feelings for Dido. The situation came to a head during a royal hunt, when a sudden storm forced Dido and Aeneas to seek shelter in an isolated cave. Their pent-up feelings could no longer be denied. There, protected from the rain and cut off from the world, they finally gave themselves over to the passion that had been growing between them. News of their union spread quickly throughout Carthage. Dido, who had sworn never to marry again after the death of her first husband, now considered her relationship with Aeneas to be a de facto marriage. The Carthaginians, meanwhile, began to murmur. Some nobles viewed the growing influence of the Trojans in the city with suspicion. Juno watched events with perverse satisfaction. If Aeneas established himself in Carthage, the prophecies about Rome would never come true. The goddess began to spread rumors among the Carthaginians, feeding their suspicions about the Trojans' true intentions. Winter arrived, and with it an apparent stability. Aeneas seemed to have temporarily forgotten his destiny, lost in the pleasures of his life with Dido and the responsibilities of helping to govern Carthage. The Trojan ships remained anchored in the harbor, slowly being covered in seaweed and barnacles. But Jupiter could not allow fate to be diverted. The king of the gods sent Mercury, his messenger, with a stern message for Aeneas. The winged god found the prince supervising the construction of new walls, dressed in Carthaginian clothes and wearing local jewelry. "Have you forgotten who you are?" thundered Mercury, his voice carrying the authority of Jupiter. "The gods didn't save you from Troy so that you could build the walls of another city. Your destiny and the future of your son awaits in Italy. Every moment you spend here is a betrayal of your people and of God's will." The god's words struck Aeneas like a thunderbolt. All the guilt he had suppressed, all the weight of fate he had tried to ignore, came back in full force. He knew Mercury was right. He couldn't go on living this borrowed life in Carthage. In secret, Aeneas began to prepare for his departure. He ordered his men to repair the ships and gather supplies, all under the pretext of a trading expedition. His heart broke at the thought of Dido, but his duty to his people and his divine destiny could no longer be ignored. But in a city where the walls have ears, secrets rarely remain hidden for long. Rumors of Trojan preparations reached the ears of Dido, who initially refused to believe them. When the truth could no longer be denied, her grief turned into a fury that shook the foundations of Carthage. Confronting Aeneas in his private chambers, Dido let all her anguish spill over. "Is this how you repay my hospitality, my love?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. I broke my vows for you, gave up my heart and my kingdom, and you plan to leave like a thief in the night. Aeneas tried to explain about fate, about divine orders, but his words rang hollow in the face of Dido's genuine pain. The gods you mention are cruel, she replied bitterly. What kind of fate requires you to break the heart of the one who loved and protected you? The news of the Trojans' imminent departure divided Carthage. Some citizens, who had developed bonds of friendship with the refugees, regretted their departure. Others saw it as confirmation of their suspicions about Aeneas' true intentions. The night before his planned departure, Aeneas couldn't sleep. His thoughts oscillated between his divine duty and the love he felt for Dido. The preparations were complete, and his men were waiting for his orders to set sail at the first sign of dawn. Outside her chambers, Carthage remained restless, as if the city itself sensed the imminent separation. Dido, consumed by anguish, sought advice from her sister Anna, who tried in vain to calm her tormented spirit. Maybe we can still convince him to stay, Anna suggested, but Dido had already noticed the determination in Aeneas' eyes. She knew that look. It was the same one she saw in her own reflection when she decided to flee Tyre to found Carthage. Meanwhile, Ascanius, who had grown fond of life in Carthage, questioned his father about the need to leave. Why can't we stay here? We have a home now, the boy asked, his innocence making the answer even more difficult for Aeneas. Our destiny calls us elsewhere, son. Sometimes we must follow the path that the gods have laid out, even when our hearts desire another course. The Trojans began to move silently through the city before dawn, loading supplies and equipment onto the ships. The atmosphere was tense, with some Carthaginians watching in silence, others discreetly helping their Trojan friends. The loyalty that had developed between the two peoples made the separation all the more painful. From the top of her tower, Dido watched the preparations with a mixture of despair and anger. Her hands trembled as she held an amulet that Aeneas had given her, a gift from Troy that now seemed to mock her betrayed trust. In a fit of rage, she summoned a priestess known for her mystical arts. The priestess, an old woman from the countryside, began to prepare a cursed ritual. Herbs were burned on a makeshift altar, while ancient words were muttered under the light of the fading stars. Dido, although hesitant at first, felt that her pain needed an outlet. Aeneas, feeling the weight of his decision, made one last attempt to explain himself. He found Dido in her private gardens, where they had so often shared moments of happiness. I'm not leaving for lack of love, he began, but because a destiny greater than both of us is calling me. Dido's reply was as sharp as a blade. Your destiny? What about the destiny we've built here? Of the promises we made? The walls we built together? Her words carried not only accusation, but a deep disappointment that made Aeneas question his resolve once again. At the port, Achates was overseeing the final preparations, keeping an eye out for any sign of trouble. Some Carthaginian sailors, loyal to Dido, seemed ready to prevent the departure, but were restrained by superior orders. The queen, even in her grief, would not allow blood to be shed. In his last moments in Carthage, Anchises made offerings to the gods, asking for protection for the journey ahead. The old man felt the weight of responsibility for having insisted on leaving, but he remained firm in his conviction that they were following the right path. As dawn approached, the tension in the city reached its peak. Dido, in a last act of defiance, climbed to the highest point of her palace. From there, she could see all of Carthage and the port where the Trojan ships were preparing to set sail. Her solitary figure, cut out against the sky that was beginning to lighten, became a symbol of the tragedy that was unfolding. The first rays of sunlight found the Trojan fleet already on the move. Aeneas, on the deck of his flagship, forced himself not to look back, fearing that his resolve would falter if he saw Carthage one last time. But the cry that tore through the morning air made every Trojan heart tremble. It was Dido's voice, full of pain and fury, proclaiming her curse. May there never be peace between our peoples. May future generations bear the weight of this betrayal. May the sea and the earth rise against you, Aeneas, just as my heart rises in curse. The queen's words seemed to have a power of their own, echoing over the waters and making the sails of the ships shudder. Some Trojan sailors made gestures to ward off evil, while others prayed silently for divine protection. Aeneas, while maintaining his stoic expression, felt every word like an arrow in his chest. Ascanio, clinging to the ship's rail, looked out over the city he had learned to call home. Silent tears streamed down his young face as he tried to understand why fate demanded such painful sacrifices. His father, noticing his son's distress, placed a protective hand on his shoulder, but found no words of consolation. As Carthage receded into the horizon, dark smoke began to rise from the city. Rumors swirled among the ships about a great fire in the royal palace, but Aeneas forbade any mention of returning. Fate was calling them forward to Italy, and the price of looking back had already proved too high. The fleet was now sailing under a sky that seemed heavier, as if carrying the weight of curses and broken promises. The Trojans, although united in their common destiny, felt that something fundamental had changed. Their stay in Carthage had transformed them, and the consequences of this transformation would echo through the centuries to come. The Trojan fleet now faced turbulent waters, as if the sea itself were responding to Dido's curse. The waves beat against the ship's hulls with renewed force, while dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Aeneas, still tormented by the events in Carthage, stood firm at his post, his eyes fixed in the direction the oracles had indicated. Achates approached his leader, noticing the deep circles under his eyes that marked his friend's face. "The men are restless," he reported in a low voice. "Some fear that Dido's curse will haunt us to the end." Aeneas nodded silently, understanding his companion's fear, for he himself felt the weight of that departure on his soul. During the nights, when sleep didn't come, Aeneas was haunted by visions. He saw Dido in her last hours in Carthage, her haughty figure transformed by the pain of betrayal. In his nightmares, the flames that consumed the palace seemed to reach him across distances, painfully reminding him of the fall of Troy. Ascanius, showing a maturity beyond his years, began to spend more time with his grandfather Anchises, absorbing the ancient stories and prophecies that spoke of his fate in Italy. The boy was beginning to understand the weight of the inheritance he was carrying, although his heart still held sweet memories of his days in Carthage. The journey continued for days that turned into weeks. The winds, sometimes favorable, sometimes contrary, seemed to play with the Trojans' determination. During a refueling stop on a small island, Anchises fell seriously ill. The fever that overtook the old man worried everyone, especially as his words of wisdom had become fundamental to maintaining the crew's morale. "Don't let my condition divert you from our purpose," whispered Anchises to Aeneas during a moment of lucidity. "Italy awaits, and with it the fate of our people." His words were interspersed with coughing fits that made his frail body tremble. Aeneas held his father's hand, feeling as if each of the old man's labored breaths was another weight on his shoulders. As they approached the coast of Sicily, the omens became more frequent. Birds of unknown species flew over the ships, and some nights were illuminated by shooting stars that crisscrossed the sky in patterns that the elders interpreted as divine signs. It was in the waters near Sicily that Anchises, the wise counselor and beloved father, closed his eyes for the last time. His death, although expected, struck Aeneas like a brutal blow. The funeral took place according to Trojan rituals, with the old man's body being consigned to the flames on a makeshift pyre on the Sicilian coast. During the funeral ceremonies, Aeneas realized that he had lost not only his father, but also a vital link to Troy's past. Anchises had been the guardian of traditions, the interpreter of divine signs, and his absence left a void that seemed impossible to fill. The stop in Sicily lasted longer than planned. The funeral games in honor of Anchises brought together not only the Trojans, but also the locals who joined in the celebrations. Competitions in running, wrestling, and archery helped renew the crew's spirit, reminding them of the glories of their past and the promises of their future. It was during these games that Ascanio really began to stand out as a future leader. His skill with the bow and his natural grace in the equestrian events drew applause from the spectators and filled Aeneas with pride. The boy who had left Troy on his father's shoulders was turning into a young prince worthy of his lineage. As the games continued, some Trojan women, exhausted from the long journey and fearful of further dangers at sea, began to question the need to continue. Inspired by Juno, who had not yet given up on preventing the Trojans' fate, they set fire to some of the fleet's ships during the night. The ensuing chaos once again tested Aeneas' leadership. Torn between saving the ships and maintaining the unity of his people, he was forced to make difficult decisions. Some Trojans, especially the elderly and families with young children, were allowed to remain in Sicily, with a local king offered land for their settlement. With a reduced fleet but a more determined crew, the Trojans finally resumed their journey towards Italy. Anchises' last words echoed in Aeneas' mind. Destiny awaited them, and no obstacle, no matter how great, could stop them from reaching it. As the shores of Italy began to appear on the horizon, a new energy took hold of the ships. Years of travel, loss and hardship had forged this group of refugees into something stronger. They were no longer just survivors of Troy, but the founders of something new, the bearers of a legacy that would transcend their own lives. Aeneas, standing at the bow of his ship, contemplated the future that was approaching. The prophecies spoke of wars to come, of alliances to be forged, and of an empire that would surpass all others. But at that moment, watching his son Ascanius by his side and feeling the spiritual presence of his father Anchises, he knew that all the losses and sacrifices had not been in vain. The waters that separated them from their destination seemed calmer now, as if the gods themselves recognized that this epic journey was coming to an end. The setting sun tinted the sky golden, and in those colors Aeneas saw the promise of a new dawn for his people. In the beginning, there was only the vast ocean plunged into infinite darkness. The black waters stretched as far as the eye could see, and the silence was broken only by the gentle movement of the waves that danced eternally without destination. In this primordial setting, a single being stood out, the raven, a majestic creature with black feathers that reflected what little light there was in the void. This was no ordinary crow. Its eyes shone with ancient wisdom, and its wings carried the power of creation itself. Kokoro, as it was known in ancient languages, had emerged from the shadows themselves, born from a thought of the universe. His solitude was his only companion as he flew over the infinite ocean, observing his own reflection in the dark waters. For eons that could not be measured, Kokoro flew without rest, this curious mind constantly searching for something beyond the monotony of darkness. In her heart, a burning desire for change grew, then inexplicable will to transform that emptiness into something more. It was then, in a moment of deep contemplation, that he realized he was not alone in his journey. From the depths of the ocean, an ancient voice emerged, as old as time itself. It was Namaka, the spirit of the primordial waters, who had long been watching Raven in his solitary flight. His presence was manifested through gentle ripples on the surface of the sea, forming patterns that only Kokoro could interpret. "Why do you fly aimlessly, shadow architect?" asked Namaka, his voice echoing across the waters. "What are you looking for in this infinite void?" Kokoro landed on a wave that hung suspended, like a liquid throne created especially for him. "I seek purpose," he replied, his words carrying the weight of 1,000 thoughts. "This world is too vast to remain in the shadows." It was at this moment that Kokoro discovered his true nature. In his wings slept the power to turn dreams into reality. In his beak he carried the ability to shape the shapeless. And in his heart, he held the desire to create something extraordinary. On the endless horizon, Kokoro saw something that no one else could see. 3 small points of light, so distant that they seemed like an illusion. They were the celestial boxes, mystical containers that held the secrets of luminosity. Raven knew, either by instinct or fate, that these objects held the key to transforming that world of darkness. Namaka, sensing Kokoro's thoughts, became restless. "The heavenly boxes are sacred," she warned, her waters shimmering with concern. "They were sealed by the ancients, those who came before us. Disturbing them could bring consequences that even I cannot foresee." But Kokoro had already made up his mind. With a determined flap of his wings, he launched himself towards the heavenly boxes. His journey would not be easy. The shadows themselves seemed to want to keep him away, creating air currents that tried to divert his course. The wind howled with ancient voices, warning of the dangers of his endeavor. As he flew, Kokoro began to understand that it wasn't just the darkness that needed to be transformed. It was the very fabric of reality that was crying out for change. In his flight, he could feel the weight of responsibility on his wings. He was not just a creator, but a guardian of what was to come. The waters beneath him began to churn more strongly, as if the ocean itself was responding to his determination. Namaka, although worried, couldn't help but admire Raven's courage. She knew that this moment would mark the beginning of a new era, for better or worse. As she approached the heavenly boxes, Kokoro could feel the ancient energy emanating from them. Each one pulsed with a different kind of light. One was golden like the brightest sun, another silver like the most delicate moonlight, and the third sparkled with thousands of tiny points of light like the stars that were yet to be born. The challenge before him was monumental. The boxes were protected by mystical seals, created to resist the passage of time in attempts to tamper with them. But Kokoro was no ordinary being. In his essence, he carried the very force of creation, a gift that even he didn't fully understand. Namaka watched everything with growing apprehension. The waters under her domain moved in increasingly complex patterns, reflecting her restlessness. She knew that the balance of the void was about to be altered forever, and the consequences of this change would be irreversible. With a precise movement, Kokoro reached the first box. His bright eyes studied the intricate patterns that sealed it, trying to understand its secrets. He knew that his every action from that moment on would shape not only the physical world, but also the fate of all beings yet to come. The first seal began to crack under his touch, releasing a thin beam of golden light that cut through the darkness like a sharp blade. It was only the beginning of a transformation that would change the face of that primordial universe forever. Kokoro, the architect of shadows, was about to take the first step on his journey of creation, a journey that would lead him to shape mountains, bring forests to life, and populate the world with beings of all shapes and sizes. The wind whispered ancient prophecies, and the waters danced with renewed energy. The moment of creation had arrived, and with it, the dawn of a new era was about to awaken in the hands, or rather, the wings, of the most unlikely of creators, a raven who dared to defy the darkness. The beam of golden light that escaped from the first celestial box grew with every moment, like a primordial dawn that had never been witnessed before. Kokoro kept his beak firmly attached to the seal, his black feathers now bathed in the radiant glow emanating from the box. The power contained therein was greater than he had imagined, and for a brief moment, he felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of his own daring. Namaka watched in fascination and awe as the waters around him began to reflect that strange new light, creating dancing patterns on their surface that had never existed before. "Are you sure you're ready for the consequences of your actions, Kokoro?" His voice echoed across the waves, carrying both concern and reverence. Raven didn't answer immediately, concentrating on his task. With a precise and determined movement, he finally managed to completely break the first seal. The golden box opened in a spectacle of light and heat, releasing the sun in all its primordial glory. The incandescent sphere rose slowly over the dark horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange for the first time. The heat of the newborn sun warmed Kokoro's wings, and he felt a deep satisfaction at seeing his first act of creation manifest itself so majestically. The waters below began to glow with golden reflections, creating a spectacle never before seen in that primordial world. Without wasting any time, Raven turned his attention to the second box, the one that held the moon. The seal on this one was different, more subtle and delicate, as if it had been woven with silver threads. Kokoro realized that he would need a gentler approach this time. Using the tip of his ward, he began to carefully unravel the mystical patterns that held the box shut. As he worked, he noticed that the sun was beginning to establish its first cycle, moving slowly across the newly formed sky. It was crucial that he release the moon before the first night arrived to maintain the delicate balance that was beginning to form. The tides respond to your creation, observed Namaka, his waters moving in new rhythms, attracted by the gravitational pull of the sun. The world is changing, Kokoro, and there's no turning back. Raven knew she was right. His every action was creating new natural laws, establishing patterns that would last for eternity. With even more determination, he focused on the seal of the second box. Its silver feathers glowed with a light of their own now, as if they were absorbing the essence of the moon that was still trapped there. Finally, the second seal gave way, and the silver box opened with a soft sigh. The moon emerged, a pale, serene sphere that began its ascent into the darkening sky. Its soft light created a perfect contrast with the intense brightness of the sun that was now setting for the first time. Kokoro watched in amazement as his first two creations established a celestial dance, a cosmic ballet that would mark the rhythm of life for all the ages to come. Day and night were born at that moment, bringing with them concepts that hadn't existed before. Time, cycles, change. Only the third box remained, the one containing the stars. This one was different from the others, its surface sparkling with thousands of tiny points of light, as if it could no longer contain the energy it held inside. The seal on this last box was the most complex of the three, an intricate web of energy that seemed to change shape every time Kokoro looked at it. Namaka noticed Raven's hesitation at this latest challenge. "The stars are different," she warned, their waters reflecting the combined brilliance of the sun and moon. "They carry not only light, but also dreams and destinies. They are the weavers of stories yet to come." Kokoro understood that this last release would be the most significant. The stars would not just be points of light in the sky. They would be beacons of hope, guides for travelers, inspiration for the dreamers who would one day inhabit the world he was creating. With a delicacy that contrasted with his imposing form, the raven began to work on the last seal. His wings moved with surgical precision, undoing the mystical knots one by one. The process was slow and required all his concentration, as one false move could result in cosmic chaos. As the seal came undone, tiny points of light began to escape, like little sighs of eternity. Each star that broke free found its place in the vast night sky, gradually forming the constellations that would tell the stories of the universe. Kokoro's work was almost complete, but he knew that this was only the beginning of his journey as a creator. Light had been brought into the world, but there was still much to be done. The infinite waters begged for land, the vast empty expanses cried out for life, and the primordial silence longed for voices to fill it. The last star found its place in the firmament, completing the great work of illuminating the world. Kokoro hovered for a moment, his wings outstretched, admiring the transformation he had accomplished. The universe now pulsed with a new and vibrant energy, a rhythm that he himself had established. Namaka moved his waters in a pattern that suggested approval. "You have brought light into the world, architect," she said, her voice carrying a new tone of respect. "But the darkness still has its place in its purpose. The balance you have created is perfect." Raven knew she was right. The darkness had not been eliminated, but transformed into something just as precious. The night, with its silver moon and twinkling stars, was just as important as the sunny day. It was in this balance that the true beauty of his creation lay. While resting on a gentle wave, Kokoro was already beginning to plan his next great work. His keen eyes focused on the depths of the ocean, where he knew he would find the necessary elements for his next creation. The mainland was waiting to emerge, and with it, a new chapter in the history of the world was about to begin. With his gaze fixed on the depths of the ocean, Kokoro began his descent into the dark waters. Her wings, still shimmering with the reflection of the celestial lights she had released, cut through the air in precise movements. The world was different now, no longer plunged in perpetual darkness, but in a harmonious cycle of light and shadow. Namaka sensed the approach of the raven, and its waters opened gently like a silent invitation. "The depths hold ancient secrets," she whispered across the waves. "What do you seek in the bowels of the ocean, Creator?" Kokoro dipped her wings into the warm waters, feeling the primal energy that pulsed in the underwater currents. "I seek the substance from which the earth will be born," he replied, his voice reverberating through the waters. "This world needs more than just sky and sea." The raven's dive was deep and determined. As he descended, the waters became denser and colder. The light he had brought to the world barely penetrated these depths, creating a realm of shadows reminiscent of the beginning of time. But now, these shadows were no longer an endless void. They were a mystery to be explored. At the bottom of the ocean, Kokoro found what he was looking for: a dense, dark mass, a mixture of sand, rocks, and minerals that had lain dormant since the beginning of time. With his powerful beak, he began to work this primordial matter, shaping it with the same precision he had used to release the celestial lights. Namaka watched with growing interest as the raven worked. Its waters danced around him, sometimes helping, sometimes testing his resolve with unexpected currents. "The land you seek to create will forever change the face of the world," she commented. "My waters will have to learn new ways." The work was hard, but Kokoro didn't give up. Little by little, he began to push the mass up towards the surface. As it rose, the matter began to transform, hardening and taking shape under the influence of air and light. First a rocky peak emerged, then another and another. The sun, on its first full pass through the sky, witnessed the birth of the first mountains. Their dark slopes rose from the waters like sleeping giants, dripping primordial water back into the ocean. The moon, in its first cycle, bathed the new lands in its silvery light, revealing valleys and plains that formed between the peaks. But Kokoro knew that bare earth wasn't enough. With his wings, he began to spread different types of soil over the basic rock. Here a layer of fertile earth, there a bed of clay, further on a field of sand. Each type of soil had its purpose in the grand plan that was developing in his creative mind. The stars, watching from above, seemed to twinkle with approval as the world below them gained more complexity and texture. Their reflections in Namaka's waters created patterns that inspired Kokoro to continue his creative work. "I see the purpose in your work," said Namaka, his waves now crashing against the new rocky shores. "But I also see that this is only the beginning. The land you raise from my depths is still bare and empty." Raven landed on the highest peak of the first mountain he had created. From this privileged vantage point, he could see his creation stretching out in all directions. The lands that emerged from the waters formed complex patterns: archipelagos, peninsulas, deep valleys, and vast plains. With a flick of his wings, Kokoro began to create rivers and lakes, natural channels where the waters of Namaka could flow and settle over the new land. These waterways would be the veins of the world, bringing life and nutrients to every corner of his creation. "Every drop that flows over your land carries a promise," observed Namaka, feeling its waters divide and find new paths across the newborn continent. "I see the potential for life in every stream and lake you create." Namaka's words touched something deep in Raven's heart. Yes, life, this would be his next great challenge. But before he could take this step, he needed to prepare the ground properly. With meticulous care, he began to work on the texture of the earth, creating different environments that would one day house different forms of life. Using his powers of creation, he shaped caves in the bowels of the mountains, carved fertile valleys between the elevations, and created plains that stretched to the horizon. Each environment had its own personality, its own story to tell. The sun completed another cycle, and the moon once again bathed the new land in its silvery light. The stars continued their eternal dance in the sky, silent witnesses to Raven's tireless work. Every moment, the world took on more detail, more complexity, Kokoro knew that his work with the earth was almost complete, but something was still missing. The rocky surfaces and bare soil cried out for cover, for color, for life. His keen eye could already see the forests that would grow on the mountain slopes, the fields that would flourish on the plains, the algae that would dance in the shallows. With his wings spread, capturing the combined energy of the sun and the moon, the raven was preparing for his next great work. The creation of plant life would be his next challenge, and he could already feel the creative energy flowing through his feathers. Eager to begin this new phase of his creative journey, Namaka, sensing Kokoro's thoughts, moved his waters in a pattern that suggested expectation. "You have shaped the earth wisely," she said, her waves gently caressing the new shores. "Now it's time to cover it with the green mantle of life." Raven nodded silently, his eyes shining with the reflection of the stars. The stage was set for the next act of creation, and he couldn't wait to start painting his world with the colors of life. With his unwavering determination, Kokoro began his next act of creation. Hovering over the newly formed earth, he could feel the life energy pulsing through his black feathers. The bare soil was eagerly awaiting the touch that would transform it into a verdant paradise. First, Raven focused his attention on the banks where land and water met. With delicate movements of his wings, he scattered the first seeds of life, small algae and mosses that quickly established themselves on the damp rocks. These first life forms were simple, but fundamental to what was to come. "I see you start at the beginning," observed Namaka, his waters gently nurturing the new green creatures. "As always, your wisdom shows in the details." Kokoro continued his methodical work, gradually moving from the banks to the interior. In each different type of soil he had created, he now planted a specific variety of plant life. On the rocky slopes, he planted resistant lichens and small plants that clung to the rocks with fierce determination. As his work progressed, the plants began to evolve and diversify of their own accord, as if they had captured Raven's creative essence. Small shoots grew into bushes, which in turn inspired the birth of ever larger trees. The first forests began to appear on the slopes of the mountains, with a mixture of sun, rain, and fertile soil created the perfect conditions for growth. Kokoro watched with satisfaction as different species of trees established themselves, some tall and majestic, others twisted and ancient in their wisdom. "Each plant has its own spirit," he murmured, landing briefly on a newly formed branch. "Each one tells its own story." On the plains, Raven sowed vast fields of grasses that rippled in the wind like the waters of Namaka. The prairies stretched to the horizon, their colors changing with the passing of the sun and moon. In some places, wildflowers began to sprout spontaneously, adding vibrant spots of color to the landscape. Namaka watched in amazement as her aquatic world was complemented by this explosion of terrestrial life. Her waters now not only reflected the lights in the sky, but also the infinite shades of green that Kokoro had brought into being. In the wettest areas where fresh water accumulated in swamps and marshes, Corvo created specially adapted plants, tall reeds, sturdy cattails, and delicate aquatic plants that floated on the surface of the calm waters. Each environment had its own signature plant, perfectly adapted to the local conditions. As the plants became established, the first natural cycles began to emerge. Leaves fell and decomposed, further enriching the soil. Seeds were carried by the wind, finding new places to germinate. The earth itself seemed to breathe with this new life. "You've created more than plants," said Namaka, observing the complex systems that were forming. "You've created communities, you've created relationships. You've created a living fabric that connects everything." Raven silently agreed. He could feel the connections forming between the roots in the soil, between the treetops above, between the different species that now shared the space. It was a web of life that was becoming more complex by the moment. In special places, Kokoro created natural sanctuaries of extraordinary beauty, hidden valleys where rare flowers bloomed in cascades of color. Ancient forests where gigantic trees stood like pillars of heaven. Natural gardens where every plant seemed to have been placed with artistic precision. The work continued tirelessly. In the driest regions, Corvo created resistant plants that knew how to conserve water, peculiarly shaped cacti, thorny shrubs, and small succulents that sparkled like jewels in the desert sun. Each adaptation was a new expression of their creativity. In the higher mountains, where the air was thinner and the cold more intense, he established a specially hardy vegetation, small alpine flowers that burst into vibrant color during the brief growing seasons, and low, twisted trees that survive the strongest winds. As the green blanket spread across the world, Kokoro realized that he was creating more than just plants. He was laying the foundations for all life to come. The forests, prairies, and swamps would be the cradle of the future creatures that would inhabit his world. The stage is almost set, he thought, his black wings reflecting the shades of green that now dominated the landscape. Just one last touch to go before we can welcome the next inhabitants of this world. With that thought, Raven set to work on his next challenge, creating plants that could provide sustenance for the creatures to come. Fruit trees began to appear in sheltered valleys, their tops laden with juicy fruit. Nutritious grains grew in the fields, and energy-rich roots established themselves in the fertile soil. Namaka, ever observant, noticed how each new addition to the plant world seemed to follow a larger plan. "You think of those that come after," she commented, her waters nourishing the roots of the plants that reach their depths. "Every seed you plant carries the potential to sustain many lives." The sun and moon continued their eternal dance across the sky, marking the passage of time as the world below transformed into a living, pulsating garden. The stars twinkled above the treetops, their reflections now multiplied in the dewy leaves and night flowers that opened only under their silvery light. Kokoro knew that his work with the plant kingdom was almost complete, but he also felt that something even greater awaited him. The plants had brought color and life to the world, but there was still a lack of movement, a lack of voices, a lack of creatures who could appreciate and inhabit this paradise he had created. With his wings open to the wind, Raven contemplated his next great challenge, to bring into being the beings that would give life and movement to this green world. It would be his most complex and important creation yet, and he couldn't wait to get started. Kokoro flew over his verdant world, admiring the symphony of life he had created. The forests whispered ancient secrets, the prairies danced with the wind, and the waters of Namaka reflected the celestial ballet of the sun, moon, and stars. But Raven felt that his work was not yet complete. The final breath of life was missing, the creatures that would give voice and movement to this majestic scenery. Landing gently on an old bridge, Kokoro began to gather his creative energy. This time, her work would be more delicate and complex than ever. Creating living beings would require not only form and substance, but also spirit and purpose. "The waters yearn for inhabitants," whispered Namaka, his waves gently lapping the verdant shores. "I feel the emptiness in the depths that only life can fill." The raven nodded and, with a graceful movement of its wings, began its work in the waters. First came the fish, small and bright, cutting through the waves and silvery shores. Then larger creatures emerged from the depths, playful dolphins, majestic whales, and a myriad of sea creatures that filled Namaka's oceans with movement and purpose. But Kokoro didn't just stop at the waters. Turning his attention to dry land, he began to populate the forests and grasslands. From the smallest insects to the most imposing mammals, each creature was carefully thought out to occupy its specific place in the great fabric of life. Birds were his most special creations. As he himself had wings, he paid extra attention to his winged cousins. Delicate hummingbirds, majestic eagles, wise owls. Each was given a unique gift, a special way to contribute to the harmony of the world. "You create not just bodies, but stories," observed Namaka, watching as each creature integrated perfectly into its surroundings. The butterflies danced among the flowers she had seen Kokoro plant, the deer grazed on the prairies he had sown, and the bears found shelter in the caves he had carved. As the creatures multiplied, they began to establish their own relationships and cycles. Predator and prey, pollinator and flower. Each being found its role in the great dance of life. The once silent world now pulsed with roars, chants, hums, and calls. Kokoro flew from one habitat to another, adjusting and refining his creation. In the mountains, agile goats and majestic eagles made the heights their home. In the swamps, frogs and herons created a natural orchestra of sounds. In the grasslands, herds of herbivores grazed peacefully under the watchful eye of predators. Each creature carries a spark of your creative essence, said Namaka, observing how life spread and adapted. I see your wisdom in the way each one finds its place. Raven continued his work, now focusing on the smallest details. He created insects to pollinate flowers and aerate the soil, small rodents to spread seeds, and a myriad of microscopic creatures to maintain the balance of ecosystems. The seasons began to influence animal behavior. Some migrated as the weather changed, others hibernated during colder periods, and still others adapted their appearance and behavior to suit the different times of year. You have created more than life, observed Namaka. You have created stories that will unfold for generations. And so was, each creature had its own role in the world's grand narrative. The songbirds heralded the dawn, the wolves howled at the moon that Kokoro had released, and the whales sang ancient melodies in the depths of Namaka. The raven landed again on the highest peak, observing his creation in all its glory. The world was now a vibrant and dynamic place, where each being lived in harmony with the others and their environment. It is done, he finally said, his words echoing through time. The world is complete. Namaka moved his waters in a pattern of agreement. Yes, it is complete but never finished. What you have created will continue to grow, change, and adapt. Each creature carries within it the potential for evolution and transformation. And so, Kokoro, the Raven creator, completed his great work. The world that had once been just darkness and water now pulsed with life in all its forms. The celestial lights he had unleashed illuminated a planet rich in diversity and beauty. But even though he had completed his task, Raven knew that his role was not over. Now he would be the guardian, the observer, the one who would watch over the delicate balance he had established. The stars continued their eternal dance in the sky. The sun and moon kept up their perpetual dance, and the waters of Namaka embraced the earth with their ancient wisdom. And in the midst of all this, Kokoro flew, his black wings reflecting the light that he himself had brought to the world, eternal guardian of the creation that had been born from his power and his imagination. The world was complete, but its story had only just begun. Every sunrise would bring new adventures. Every moonset would hold new mysteries. And every shining star would bear witness to the infinite stories that were yet to come in the world Raven had created. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the skies of ancient China with shades of red and gold reminiscent of the flames that almost consumed the world. Hui, the most skilled archer in the celestial realm, watched the only remaining sun complete its daily journey, remembering the events that changed the fate of humanity forever. His fingers instinctively caressed the familiar texture of his bow, while his thoughts wandered to the days when 10 blazing suns threatened to turn the earth into a lifeless desert. In their modest mountain home, his wife Chang'a was preparing afternoon tea, her movements as graceful as the dance of cherry blossoms in the wind. The soft scent of jasmine filled the room, mingling with the breeze coming through the rice paper windows. It was hard to believe that, just a few months earlier, that same air was so hot that it burned the lungs of anyone who dared to breathe it. Still thinking about that day, Chang'a asked softly, approaching with 2 cups of tea in her hands. Her dark eyes reflected the concern she felt for her husband, who carried the weight of his actions like an invisible cloak over his shoulders. Hui nodded, accepting the cup she offered him. How could I not think? 9 heavenly brothers, 9 divine lives that I had to extinguish to save countless others. Her voice trembled slightly, revealing the depth of her anguish. The couple remained in contemplative silence, watching the first stars appear in the twilight sky. In a small carved wooden chest, carefully stored in their bedroom, lay the reward Hui had received from the Celestial Empress, the elixir of immortality, a gift that, although valuable, weighed on their consciences like a cursed precious stone. In the days following the great hunt of the suns, rumors began to spread about the existence of the elixir. Whispers in the village streets, covetous glances from strangers who passed their house, shadows that seemed to follow them when they went to the market. The threat was silent, but it grew like weeds after the rain. Chama watched her husband with growing concern. Every day, new stories reached her ears about bandits and warlords planning to steal the elixir. Some said that entire armies were mobilizing, waiting for the right moment to strike. The peace they had longed for after saving the world seemed more and more distant. One night, while Hui slept, Chama was startled awake by a noise coming from the garden. Through the silver moonlight, she saw shadows sneaking between the trees. Her heart raced as she realized that her fears were coming true. Quietly, she got up and went to the chest where the elixir was kept. Her hands trembled as she held the delicate bottle containing the golden liquid. Years of love and dedication to her husband weighed heavily on her heart against the responsibility she felt to protect something so powerful. The voices of the invaders approaching the house echoed in her ears like a dark omen. In a moment of crystal clarity, Chana understood what she needed to do. With silent tears streaming down her face, she woke Hui with a gentle touch. "My love," she whispered, "forgive me for what I'm about to do. It's the only way to keep the elixir out of the wrong hands." Before Hui could react, Chana brought the bottle to her lips and drank its contents in a single gulp. Immediately, an ethereal light began to emanate from her body, and she felt lighter than air. Hui, now fully awake, stretched out his arms to reach her, but his fingers only passed through the luminous form of his beloved. "Chanya," he shouted, his voice filled with despair and disbelief. The invaders, alerted by the shout, burst through the door, only to witness the moment when Chana began to float towards the night sky. As she ascended, Chana kept her eyes fixed on her husband's, trying to memorize every detail of his beloved face. The wind whispered old songs of love and loss in her ears as the distance between them grew inexorably. The moon, big and bright in the sky, seemed to be calling her, offering a refuge for her lonely eternity. The bandits, realizing they had arrived too late, fled into the night, leaving Hui alone with his pain. He remained in the garden until dawn, his bow forgotten at his side, watching the moon where his beloved would now dwell forever. On the horizon, the single sun he had spared began its daily journey, a constant reminder of the price they had both paid for the good of humanity. On the moon, Chana found an unexpected companion, a jade rabbit, eternally busy preparing the elixir of immortality in its celestial pestle. The rhythmic sound of his work became the music that filled his lonely nights as he watched the earth spinning below, so close and yet eternally out of reach. Thus began the legend of Chang'e, the Lady of the Moon, whose sacrifice for the greater good eternally separated her from her beloved Hui. Her story would become an eternal reminder that sometimes the truest love manifests itself not in unity, but in the sacrifice necessary to protect those we love and the world we share. The weeks after Chang'e's ascent to the moon were a blur of pain and regret for Hui. The silence in her home was deafening, every corner still echoing with memories of her beloved. The teacups she used to prepare remained untouched, covered in a fine layer of dust, as he didn't have the heart to move them from where she had last left them. During the day, Hui wandered through the fields and mountains he had once traversed with his bow, hunting and protecting the nearby villages. Now, the instrument that had made him famous rarely left its corner on the wall. His hands, once firm and precise, trembled slightly when he touched the bowstring, as if the object itself shared his sadness. The villagers, who had once revered him as a hero, now watched him with a mixture of pity and silent respect. Some of the elders left offerings on his doorstep, bowls of rice, fresh fruit, jasmine tea, but Hui barely touched the food. His appetite, like his will to live, seemed to have risen to the moon along with Chang'e. One night, While gazing at the full moon from his garden, Hui noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was the old sage of the mountain, an old man who had long served as a counselor and healer for the inhabitants of the region. His eyes, although clouded by age, still shone with an ancient wisdom. "Grief can be a treacherous companion, young archer," said the old man, taking a seat next to Hui. "It promises comfort in the familiar presence of pain, but ends up imprisoning us in a cage of our own construction." Hui turned his gaze to the old man, his words touching something deep in his broken heart. "How can I move on when every breath reminds me of her? When every glance of the night sky shows me what I've lost?" The wise old man smiled gently, his wrinkled fingers tracing patterns in the damp earth. "Your wife didn't choose her fate out of whim or cowardice. She made a sacrifice not only for the greater good, but also for you. Honoring her memory means living the life she protected with such love." The elder's words pierced the fog of sadness that enveloped Hui. For the first time since Chana's departure, he began to consider his own role in the story that was still being written. His beloved had become an eternal guardian, protecting the elixir of immortality from the wrong hands. Shouldn't he also find a purpose that honored his sacrifice? In the days that followed, Hui slowly began to emerge from his cocoon of sadness. He returned to practicing with his bow, although each arrow he shot still carried the weight of his memories. He began teaching young archers in the village, sharing not only his skills with the bow, but also the lessons of honor, sacrifice, and love that his story with Chana had taught him. In the evenings, when the moon shone brightest, Hui would sit in his garden and talk to Chana, telling him about his day, about his students' progress, about the small changes in the village. Sometimes, when the night breeze blew gently, he could swear he heard her laughter on the wind, or felt the soft touch of her hand on his face. The jade rabbit, Chana's faithful companion on the moon, watched these nocturnal conversations as he continued his eternal work of preparing the elixir. The rhythmic sound of his celestial pestle became a kind of background music for the words of love and longing that Hui sent to the heavens. One day, while training a particularly promising group of young archers, Hui noticed something different in the air. A heavenly messenger, shining with a light of its own, descended from the heavens, bringing news of the heavenly empress. Silence fell over the training ground as everyone watched the ethereal figure approach. "Hui, the great archer," announced the messenger, his voice resounding like crystal bells. "The heavenly empress has observed your pain and your strength. She has seen how you have honored your beloved sacrifice and how you continue to serve humanity despite your loss." Hui's heart raced, a mixture of hope and apprehension growing in his chest. The messenger continued, "In recognition of your nobility and Chana's sacrifice, the Empress has decreed that once a year, during the Mid-Autumn Festival, you may visit your beloved on the moon." The news spread quickly through the village and beyond. People began to prepare for what would become one of the most beautiful celebrations in Chinese culture. Lanterns were hung, mooncakes were prepared, and stories about the eternal love between Hui and Chana began to be told in every home. As the date of the festival drew closer, Hui felt his heart lighter than it had been in months. The prospect of seeing Chana again, even for a brief moment, gave new meaning to each day. He began to look at the moon with new eyes, no longer just as a symbol of his loss, but as a reminder of the strength of true love and the power of sacrifice for the greater good. The arrival of the Mid-Autumn Festival transformed the landscape of ancient China. Everywhere, red lanterns decorated the streets and houses, their lights dancing like little earthly stars. The air carried the sweet scent of mooncakes, prepared with dedication by families celebrating the promise of reunion between lovers separated by fate. Hui watched the preparations with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. His students, realizing the importance of the moment, had offered to help with the rituals necessary for his temporary ascension. The old sage of the mountain supervised everything, ensuring that every detail was in accordance with the heavenly messenger's instructions. "Remember," said the old man, as he lit incense on a makeshift altar, "time on the moon flows differently. What will seem like a night to us here on earth will be like a precious moment suspended in eternity for you too." As the full moon began its ascent over the horizon, bigger and brighter than anyone had ever seen, Howie felt an ancient and powerful energy envelop him. His body began to feel lighter, and a golden light similar to the one that had enveloped Chang'e on his departure now surrounded him. The ascent was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was like floating on a river of silver light, while the stars danced around him. The air became thinner, but Howie felt no lack of oxygen. A deep peace enveloped him, as if every moment of pain and loneliness from the last few months was being washed away by the moonlight. When his feet touched the lunar surface, Howie was momentarily dazzled by the ethereal beauty of the place. The ground glowed with a soft jade hue, and on the horizon, crystal palaces reflected the light of the stars in thousands of different colors. The silence was absolute, but somehow comforting. It was then that he saw her. Chang'e was more beautiful than in his memories, her figure emanating a soft light and her black hair dancing in a non-existent breeze. Beside her, the jade rabbit momentarily interrupted his eternal work, his glowing eyes watching the lovers reunite. "My love," whispered Chang'e, his voice carrying the echo of eternity. "You've come." Howie ran towards her, his arms closing around her in an embrace that tried to make up for all the months of separation. Silent tears streamed down both their faces, but they were tears of joy, no longer of sadness. "I've missed you so much," said Howie, her voice choked with emotion. "Every day without you was like an endless winter." Chang'e smiled, gently touching her husband's face. "I watched you every day, my dear. I saw your pain, your growth, and how you honored our love by teaching others the value of sacrifice and courage." The jade rabbit approached silently, offering them a small table with tea and heavenly mooncakes. The aroma was both familiar and unlike anything Howie had ever experienced, as if the stars themselves had been distilled into a drink. As they shared this heavenly meal, Chang'e told Howie about his life on the moon. She talked about the peace she found in her role as guardian, about the silent conversations with the jade rabbit, and about how every night she sent her blessings to Earth through the moonlight. "It's not as lonely an existence as you might think," she explained, her fingers intertwined with his. "Every ray of moonlight that touches the Earth carries a bit of my love for you and for the humanity we are sworn to protect." Howie talked about her students, about how their story had spread and inspired others to make sacrifices for the common good. He talked about the changes in the village, about how people now celebrated their love as a symbol of hope and devotion. Time seemed to flow differently on the moon, as the wise old man had warned. Moments stretched out like eternities, and hours passed like seconds. Starlight danced around them, creating patterns that told ancient stories of love and sacrifice. "Even separated by distance," said Chang'e, "our love continues to grow and inspire others. Perhaps this is the true purpose of our destiny, to show that true love transcends even the barriers between heaven and earth." The jade rabbit, who had returned to his eternal work, was making soft music with his pestle, a melody that seemed to lull the universe into a cosmic dance. Howie and Chang'e danced under the stars, their movements in perfect harmony with the celestial rhythm. As their time together came to an end, there was no sadness in their hearts, only a deeper understanding of the meaning of their love and sacrifice. Chang'e gently kissed Howie's lips, a kiss that carried the promise of future meetings and eternal love. "Take the moonlight with you," she whispered, "and know that on every clear night, when I look up at the sky, I'll be looking back at you, my beloved archer." Howie felt the same golden energy begin to envelop him again, signaling that it was time to return to Earth. His last glimpse was of Chang'e, radiant in her immortal beauty, alongside the faithful jade rabbit, both waving goodbye as he gently descended back into the mortal world. By the time Howie returned to Earth, the Mid-Autumn Festival had turned into an even more meaningful celebration. The people of the village who had witnessed his ascent to the moon eagerly awaited his return, still lit lanterns illuminating the night with a welcoming glow. The old sage of the mountain was the first to welcome him, his wise eyes shining with curiosity and understanding. In the days that followed, Hui noticed a profound change in himself. The pain of separation, although still present, had transformed into something softer, more meaningful. Every time he looked at the moon, he saw not just the place where his beloved lived, but a reminder of the transformative power of true love. The archer began to devote more time to teaching, sharing not only archery techniques, but also the lessons he had learned on his journey. His students, now more numerous than ever, came from far and wide, attracted not only by his legendary skill with the bow, but also by the wisdom that emanated from his words. True power lies not in the strength of the arm that draws the bow, he would tell his young apprentices, but in the strength of the heart that guides the arrow. His words carried the weight of experience, tempered by the love and sacrifice that had shaped his life. One particularly meaningful afternoon, while supervising the training, Hui noticed a young woman among his students who reminded him of Chana. She had the same determination in her eyes, the same gentle but resolute spirit. Her name was Mei Ling, and she had traveled from far away after hearing the story of the archer and his beloved on the moon. "Master Hui," said Mei Ling after a training session, "the people in my village tell different versions of your story. Some speak only of the sadness of separation, others of the heroism of defeating the 9 suns. But what is the real lesson we must learn?" Hui reflected for a moment, watching the sun set over the horizon. "The real lesson, Mei Ling, is that love is not measured by physical proximity, but by the depth of the sacrifice we are willing to make for the sake of those we love and for the greater good." Her words touched something deep in the hearts of everyone present. Over the next few days, more stories began to emerge about how Chana's sacrifice and Hui's devotion had inspired acts of courage and selflessness across China. One particularly touching story came from a distant village, where a young girl had risked her life to save children from a fire, citing Chana's courage as her inspiration. Elsewhere, a feudal lord, moved by the archer's story, had abandoned his war plans and dedicated his resources to helping those in need. The jade rabbit, watching all this from the moon, shared these stories with Chana as she continued her eternal work. She smiled as she saw how her sacrifice had become a source of inspiration and hope for so many. One evening, as Hui watched his students practicing by the light of the lanterns, the wise old man approached again. "Do you realize," he said, "that your story with Chana has become more than a tale of love? It has become a beacon of light for those who seek to find strength in difficult times." Hui nodded, deeply understanding the truth in the elder's words. "Every time I teach someone to shoot a bow," he replied, "I'm not just teaching them a skill. I'm sharing a part of our history, a part of the love that Chana and I share." The next festival brought a new tradition to the village. In addition to mooncakes and lanterns, people began to write letters of love, hope, forgiveness, and burn them in small bonfires under the full moon, believing that their words would reach Chana, who would bless them with his heavenly grace. Mei Ling, who had become one of Hui's most dedicated students, organized a special performance during the festival. Together with other archers, she coordinated a demonstration where arrows with miniature lanterns were shot into the night sky, creating a light show that seemed to dance with the stars. Hui himself, watching the demonstration, felt his heart fill with pride and gratitude. Each little light that rose into the sky was like a messenger of hope, a reminder that even on the darkest nights, love finds ways to light the way. And so the story of Hui and Chana continued to grow and transform, no longer just as a tale of separation and sacrifice, but as a testament to the enduring power of true love and its ability to inspire generations. Each new student who learned the art of the bow, each story shared around the festival bonfires, each gaze directed at the full moon, carried with it a piece of that eternal love that had transcended the barriers between heaven and earth. The years passed like leaves carried by the autumn wind, and Hui's wisdom grew along with her legend. His hair, once as black as the moonless night, now displayed silver strands that shone like the stars he watched so much. His eyes, although more wrinkled, retained the same intense glow that had captured Chana's heart so many years ago. The archery school he had established had become a center of learning not only for martial arts, but also for the deeper lessons of love, sacrifice, and devotion. Mei Ling, now a master archer in her own right, assisted Hui in training the next generation, perpetuating not only the techniques, but also the values that had become the heart of his teachings. One particularly meaningful afternoon, while watching her students practice, Hui noticed something different in the air. A gentle breeze carried cherry blossom petals, out of season, dancing in patterns that resembled celestial calligraphy. The old sage of the mountain, now even older but just as perceptive, appeared silently beside him. "The signs are present, my friend," said the old man, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom. "The celestial empress has been watching your journey with great interest." That night, as the moon rose over the horizon, a new heavenly messenger descended from the heavens, his light softer than the first who had brought the news of the annual festival. His eyes shone with the compassion of ancient stars, and his voice echoed like distant music. "Hui, guardian of the One Sun," announced the messenger, "your dedication to sharing the lessons of love and sacrifice has touched heavenly hearts. The Empress offers you a choice. You can ascend to the moon permanently, joining Chang'e in immortality, or remain on Earth as guardian of the stories and traditions you have inspired." The silence that followed was as heavy as the morning dew. Everyone present, students, villagers, and even the forest animals, seemed to be holding their breath, awaiting the great archer's decision. Hui closed his eyes, his heart torn between his desire to be reunited with his beloved and his responsibility to those who had trusted in his teachings. It was Mei Ling who spoke first, her voice soft but firm like the string of a well-tensioned bow. "Master, your story with Chang'e has taught us that true love transcends physical distance. Perhaps your true mission is to continue to be the bridge between heaven and earth, just as the moon is the bridge between Chang'e and us." Her words echoed deeply in Hui's soul. He remembered all the lives that had been touched by his story, all the hearts that had found courage in the example of his love for Chang'e. The heavenly messenger waited patiently, his light pulsing softly like a distant star. "My decision," Hui began, his voice carrying the certainty of one who has found his true purpose, "is to remain here, continuing to share the lessons Chang'e and I have learned on our journey. Our love doesn't need physical proximity to continue inspiring others." The messenger smiled, as if he had expected this answer. "The Celestial Empress foresaw your choice, noble archer. In recognition of your wisdom, she grants you a new gift. From now on, during each Mid-Autumn Festival, not only will you be able to visit Chang'e, but all those whose hearts are truly open to love will be able to glimpse, through the moonlight, the eternal dance of lovers separated by fate." Word spread quickly, and the Mid-Autumn Festival took on a new meaning. People began to look more closely at the moonlight during the celebration, and many swore they saw, on the clearest nights, the silhouettes of Hui and Chang'e dancing among the clouds, with a jade rabbit beating his pestle to a heavenly rhythm. The years went by, and Hui grew old with the grace of someone who accepts the natural cycle of life. His teachings were recorded in manuscripts that would be passed down from generation to generation. Mei Ling and other master archers established new schools in different parts of China, each carrying a part of the original story. On his last night on Earth, during a particularly bright Mid-Autumn Festival, Hui gathered his closest students. With a serene smile, he shared one last lesson. True love is not about possessing or always being together. It is the ability to sacrifice oneself for the greater good, to inspire others to be better, and to find beauty even in separation. That night, legends say, the moon's glow was more intense than ever. When Hui closed his eyes for the last time, his spirit did not ascend directly to the moon as many had expected. Instead, he transformed into thousands of tiny lights, like golden fireflies, which spread throughout the world. These lights, the elders say, can still be seen today during the Mid-Autumn Festival, when the love between Hui and Chang'e is celebrated. They appear as reflections in the lanterns, sparkles in the tears of separated lovers, and sparks of hope in the eyes of those who believe in the transformative power of true love. And so the story of Hui and Chang'e lives on, not just as an ancient legend, but as a constant reminder that love, in its purest and highest form, has the power to transcend even the barriers between heaven and earth, inspiring generations to find the courage to make their own sacrifices for the greater good.